Welcome to Calming Bedtime Historian Channel. Tonight we step quietly into the chilly darkness of 1880, ye America where thousands of settlers wake before dawn to lives ruled entirely by weather, labour and stubborn determination. Have you ever wondered how ordinary families survived endless routines without electricity, supermarkets, hot showers, or even reliable heat during winter? Or why so many settlers described exhaustion as something that settled into their bones like cold rain soaking through wool. So before you settle into the story, take a second to like the video and hit subscribe. And while you are here, leave a comment sharing your location and local time. It is always comforting to see where everyone is listening from tonight. Now dim the lights and let yourself drift slowly into the pale blue darkness of an American frontier morning. You wake before sunrise because nearly everyone does. The cabin remains dark except for a thin grey line near the frozen window. Your blanket feels heavy with lingering warmth, yet the air outside the covers bites immediately at your skin. The room smells faintly of ash-damp wool and old pine boards that have absorbed years of smoke. Beside you, someone coughs softly. Another person shifts beneath creaking quilts. The entire cabin seems to groan during cold mornings. Timber contracts during the night, producing quiet popping sounds that echo through the narrow room. You lie still, briefly listening to the wind brushing against the outer walls. It is not peaceful exactly, just familiar. Many settlers in 1880 America slept in one or two room cabins containing entire families. Parents, children, and sometimes distant relatives occupied spaces that modern people might consider impossibly cramped. Privacy existed rarely. Warmth mattered more. You slowly sit upright. Cold air slides through your shirt immediately. Your feet touch rough wooden flooring chilled nearly as hard as stone. Nearby the fire has almost died completely, leaving only faint orange glows buried beneath grey ash. That means work begins now. You kneel carefully beside the hearth, hearing the rustle of straw mattresses behind you. Dry kindling waits inside a small wooden crate near the fireplace. You gather thin splinters first because experienced settlers understood fire behaved almost like a living creature. It demanded patience during winter mornings. The cabin smells sharper near the ashes. Dust and smoke mingle together. You blow gently against the embers, watching tiny sparks brighten briefly before fading again. Then you try once more. This time the fire responds with a weak, crackling sound that feels strangely encouraging in the darkness. Tiny victories mattered here. You feed the growing flame carefully until yellow light begins flickering across the cabin walls. Shadows stretch over hanging coats, patched trousers, and iron cooking pots blackened from years of use. Across the room a child groans sleepily. Another pulls a blanket higher. Children worked constantly in frontier households, though many people today imagine childhood during the 19th century as carefree and simple. A well-established historical understanding suggests frontier children often carried adult responsibilities by the age of 10. Some milked cows before sunrise, others chopped wood or hauled water through snow. You glance toward the frost covering the window corners. Beautiful from a distance. Terrible to touch. The cold has crept inside overnight despite packed mud between cabin logs. Settlers spent endless hours sealing gaps against winter wind, though tiny openings always remain somewhere. A kettle soon hangs above the growing flames. Water takes time. Everything takes time here. While waiting, you pull on stiff wool clothing hanging near the fire. Your shirt smells faintly sour because washing clothes required exhausting effort involving heated water, scrubbing boards, and enormous patience. Many settlers owned very few garments, particularly in isolated farming regions. You lace heavy boots slowly. The leather feels hard from yesterday's frozen mud. Outside, faint sounds drift through the darkness. Somewhere nearby, a rooster calls uncertainly into the cold morning air. A horse snorts beside a barn. Wind brushes through bare tree branches with a dry rattling sound. The frontier wakes gradually, not gracefully. You finally step toward the door and open it carefully. blade of icy air slices immediately across your face. Your breath appears in pale clouds while darkness stretches across the frozen ground outside. The world smells clean and bitter. Wood smoke rises from distant cabins scattered across the landscape. Some families live close enough to exchange help during emergencies. Others remain isolated for miles, separated by rough roads that become nearly unusable after storms. You pause briefly on the porch. The sky has started changing colour. Deep blue slowly softens towards silver near the horizon, revealing fields stiff with frost and wagon tracks hardened into frozen ridges. Everything looks still at this hour, yet settlers already begin moving through the coal-like shadows. A nearby farmer carries buckets toward a well. Another leads animals toward feed troughs. People rise early because daylight determines survival. Kerosene lamps cost money. Candles disappear quickly. Once darkness falls, most useful labour becomes difficult or dangerous. You walk toward the woodpile beside the cabin. Fresh snow crunches beneath your boots. The sound feels strangely satisfying. You lift several heavy logs into your arms, smelling raw pine resin where wood recently split apart. Chopping wood consumed enormous amounts of frontier life. Families burned shocking quantities during winter months, simply to cook meals and avoid freezing overnight. Some settlers spent entire summers preparing fuel. Even then, shortages happened frequently. One unusual frontier habit involved warming bricks beside fireplaces before bed. Families wrapped heated bricks in cloth and placed them beneath blankets to create temporary warmth through freezing nights. Some diaries describe a people fighting quietly over the warmest brick during severe storms. You carry the logs inside carefully. The cabin now glows softly with firelight. Faces emerge gradually from blankets while sleepy voices murmur around you. Someone yawns loudly. Someone else pulls on wool socks containing careful patches around the heels. Breakfast preparations begin without ceremony. Cornmeal waits in a sack near the wall. Salt pork hangs nearby. Coffee, if available, becomes precious enough to ration carefully across long weeks. Many poorer settlers drank substitutes made from roasted grains or roots when proper coffee ran out. The smell of heating cornmeal slowly fills the room, warm and earthy, a little bland, honestly. Still, hunger sharpens appreciation quickly. You sit briefly near the fire while fingers thaw painfully beside growing flames. Heat touches your face while your back remains cold. Frontier comfort usually work that way, partial and temporary. Historians continue debating how emotionally isolated many settlers truly felt across remote territories. Some personal letters describe crushing loneliness lasting years. Others portray frontier communities as lively networks filled with dances, shared meals, and constant cooperation. Reality probably depended heavily upon geography, weather, and luck. The kettle finally begins trembling softly above the fire. Steam curls upward. The room feels more alive now. Outside, dawn fully approaches across the frozen countryside. Inside, spoons clatter against bowls while tired voices grow steadier with waking conversation. Nobody moves quickly. Energy must last all day, and the day ahead will demand nearly everything your body can offer. You look toward the small window again. Frost slowly melts near the edges from growing warmth inside the cabin. Beyond the glass, pale sunlight touches distant field for the first time this morning. Another frontier day begins. Long, cold, unavoidable, and for settlers across 1880 America, this exhausting rhythm formed the ordinary centre of life itself. The fire finally catches properly, just as the cabin begins filling with movement. You hear blankets folding, boots scraping rough floorboards, and tired voices speaking softly through lingering sleepiness. The room now glows with a warm orange light that softens the harshness of the cold morning outside, but only slightly. The warmth never spreads evenly. Your hands feel comfortable beside the flames, while your shoulders remain chilled beneath stiff wool layers. Smoke curls upward through the iron stovepipe, carrying the sharp scent of burning pine through the cabin. You crouch lower near the hearth. The heat feels wonderful. Settlers often described winter fires almost affectionately in personal journals and letters. A reliable fire meant cooked meals, dry clothing, and protection against freezing nights. Without it, even sturdy cabins quickly became dangerous during severe weather. You feed another split log into the growing flames. It cracks loudly. Tiny sparks leap upward before disappearing into the dim air above the hearth. Nearby, someone opens a small cupboard and removes a sack of cornmeal. Another person unwraps a piece of salted pork carefully preserved for winter use. Nothing is wasted here. Not crumbs, not grease, not effort. The smell of smoke thickens as breakfast preparations continue. Smoke clings permanently to frontier cabins because ventilation remained imperfect in most homes. Clothing absorbed it. Blankets absorbed it. Even hair carried the scent constantly. You probably stopped noticing eventually. At least mostly, sure. Outside the cabin walls, wind presses gently against the timber. Snow squeaks beneath distant footsteps while livestock stir inside nearby shelters. Somewhere across the settlement a dog barks once before falling silent again. Morning expands slowly across the frontier. You lift the kettle carefully using a cloth wrapped around your hand. The metal handle burns immediately without protection. Hot water pours into a basin while steam rises toward your face in soft twisting clouds. Washing comes next, though calling it washing feels generous. You splash warm water onto your face, carefully gasping as lingering cold meets sudden heat. The water smells faintly metallic from the iron kettle. A rough bar of homemade soap rests nearby, unevenly shaped and slightly greasy. Many frontier families made soap using animal fat and wood ash lye. Some batches cleaned effectively. Others irritate skin badly enough to leave red cracks along fingers and knuckles. Settlers rarely enjoyed luxury products unless they lived near prosperous towns. You dry your face using stiff cloth hanging beside the stove. Then comes another task. Always another task. You step outside carrying an empty bucket toward the well. Dawn has fully arrived now, revealing pale sunlight stretching across frozen fields. The sky appears wide beyond comprehension, fading from silver into soft blue above distant hills. The cold bites harder outdoors. It reaches inside your sleeves immediately. Your boots crunch across icy ground while smoke rises lazily from neighbouring cabins. Thin trails drift upward into the calm winter air like grey ribbons. Several other settlers already gather near the well. Nobody talks much yet. A woman wearing a thick wool shawl lowers a bucket carefully into the darkness below. Beside her, 2 children stamp their feet repeatedly for warmth while waiting their turn. One boy rubs his nose against his sleeve with complete indifference. Frontier manners often surrendered during winter. Survival mattered more. You grip the rough wooden handle attached to the rope. Frost clings against the surface, biting your skin through thin gloves. Slowly, you lower the bucket downward until a faint splash echoes from deep below. The sound feels strangely distant. Then comes the hard part. You pull steadily against the heavy rope while cold air fills your lungs sharply. Water sloshes inside the bucket as it wedges just enough point short toward the surface. A practical historical observation reveals settlers hauled astonishing amounts of water daily. Families needed water for cooking, washing, cleaning tools, caring for animals, and sometimes brewing weak homemade beer, safer than contaminated water supplies. Your shoulders already ache slightly. And breakfast has not even started properly. You carry the full bucket carefully toward the cabin, trying not to spill precious water onto the frozen ground. The weight pulls heavily against your arms while icy wind presses through your coat seams. Inside the cabin feels warmer now. The difference surprises you instantly. Cornmeal mush simmers inside a black iron pot above the fire. Salt pork crackles softly nearby, releasing rich, greasy smells that briefly overpower the smoke lingering in the room. Everyone watches the food quietly. Hunger sharpens attention. You settle onto a rough wooden chair near the table while someone pours dark coffee into mismatched tin cups. The drink smells bitter and earthy. Real coffee existed in many frontier homes by 1880, though quality varied wildly depending upon distance from trade routes. Some settlers stretched supplies using toasted chicory roots. Others used burned corn. A strange but widely repeated frontier superstition claimed spilling coffee grounds near the doorway invited unwanted visitors before sunset. Nobody entirely agreed where the belief originated, though versions appeared across several rural communities. You sip carefully from the hot tin cup. The heat stings pleasantly against your lips. Conversation finally begins around the table, though quietly at first. People discuss weather patterns, animal health, and rumours travelling between settlements. Someone mentions a neighbouring farmer losing 2 chickens during the night. Probably foxes. Possibly thieves. Nobody sounds certain. Uncertainty shaped frontier life constantly. News travelled slowly through isolated areas, often becoming distorted long before reaching distant cabins. A single story could change completely after passing through 3 farms and 1 trading post. The breakfast itself remains plain. Cornmeal, salt pork, wheat coffee. Yet the meal feels deeply satisfying because physical labour waits immediately beyond the cabin walls. Settlers consumed heavy breakfasts intentionally since many faced 10 or 12 exhausting hours outdoors afterward. You notice grease popping softly inside the skillet. The sound fills brief silences comfortably. Children begin eating faster now while adults continue discussing chores for the day ahead. One person must repair fencing damage during recent windstorms. Another plans to inspect livestock for signs of illness. Winter creates endless problems, small ones mostly, still dangerous. Scholars continue questioning how nutritious frontier diets truly remain during harsh seasons. Some researchers argue settlers adapted surprisingly well using preserved vegetables, hunting, and stored grains. Others believe vitamin deficiencies appeared far more frequently than official records suggest. Either way, food rarely brought excitement. It brought fuel. You finish the last spoonful slowly while firelight flickers across tired faces surrounding the table. Outside sunlight grows brighter against the snow-covered fields beyond the cabin windows. The real labour waits out there. Cold fields, heavy tools, long hours. And every settler around this table already understands the day will feel longer than expected before it finally ends. Breakfast disappears quickly because nobody can afford lingering beside the fire for very long. The warmth tempts you, though. Your fingers finally feel comfortable again after the freezing trip to the well, and the smell of burning pine creates a sleepy heaviness inside the cabin. Outside waits frozen mud, restless livestock, and chores stretching across the entire morning. Still, nobody complains openly. Complaining wastes energy. You rise from the rough wooden chair and gather empty tin cups from the table, while another family member scrapes leftover cornmeal from the iron pot. Nothing edible remains behind. Even hardened scraps sometimes feed chickens later. The cabin grows busier now, faster movements, sharpened purpose. Children pull coats over thin shoulders, while adults collect tools hanging beside the doorway. Leather gloves, dented buckets, lanterns, and feed sacks disappear into waiting hands with practiced efficiency. Everyone already knows their responsibilities. A respected historical understanding suggests frontier households depended heavily upon strict routines because survival required coordination. Delays during winter mornings could create larger problems later. Frozen water troughs, hungry livestock, or neglected fires quickly became serious concerns. You step outside again carrying 2 wooden buckets. The cold feels brighter now beneath the rising sun. Smoke continues drifting upward from neighbouring cabins while frost sparkles across fences surrounding nearby animal pens. The entire settlement smells faintly of wood smoke, wet hay, and livestock. Not pleasant exactly, but strangely alive. Your boots sink slightly into the packed snow as you cross toward the barn. The structure leans unevenly from years of wind exposure, though settlers repaired buildings, constantly using whatever lumber remained available. Inside, the temperature changes immediately. Still cold, less brutal. Warm animal breath fills the dim barn air with thick earthy smells. Horses shift impatiently in their stalls while cows low softly from deeper shadows near the back wall. Dust floats through narrow beams of sunlight cutting between rough wooden boards. One horse stamps loudly, another snorts against your sleeve. You move towards stacked hay bales, carrying the sweet, dry scent of summer grass preserved for winter feeding. Loose strands scratch your hands while you separate heavy bundles for the animals waiting nearby. Feeding livestock happened before nearly everything else. Animals represented survival itself. A family could recover from broken furniture or damaged clothing. Losing horses or cows created disasters lasting entire seasons. Frontier diaries repeatedly mentioned settlers sleeping beside sick livestock during severe weather, especially when valuable animals faced freezing conditions. You carry hay carefully between the stalls. The horses lower their heads immediately. Their chewing sounds fill the barn, slowly steady and rhythmic. Steam rises from their bodies into the chilly morning air while leather harnesses creak softly nearby. A younger child enters carrying another bucket. Too heavy for small arms, really. Yet children worked constantly across frontier settlements because families depended upon every available pair of hands. Some 8-year-olds milked cows daily. Others gathered eggs, carried firewood, or watched younger siblings while adults handled field labor. You hand the child a smaller bucket instead. The relief appears instantly. No words needed. Outside the barn, chickens scratch nervously around frozen patches of earth, searching for insects hidden beneath snow and mud. Their feathers puff outward against the cold while sharp clucking sounds echo across the yard. You scatter grain carefully. Immediately chaos begins. Birds dart forward from every direction, bumping into one another greedily, while wings flap against the icy morning air. Frontier chickens rarely resembled calm storybook farm animals. They behaved more like desperate little scavengers with terrible manners. One pecks your boot angrily. You step back quickly. Some frontier communities carried strange beliefs involving chickens and weather prediction. In certain rural areas, settlers claimed unusually noisy hens signaled approaching snowstorms within 2 days. Nobody fully agreed whether the birds actually sensed pressure changes or whether people simply remembered successful guesses more vividly. You move toward the water trough next. Thin ice has formed across the surface overnight. Breaking it requires effort. You strike carefully using a wooden handle until cracks spread outward in pale, jagged lines. Then the ice collapses inward with a satisfying crunch. Water sloshes heavily beneath the broken pieces, while cattle nearby shift impatiently toward the opening. Cold splashes against your gloves. Your fingers ache immediately. The wind strengthens briefly across the open yard, carrying distant sounds from neighboring farms. Somewhere far away, an axe strikes wood in slow-measured rhythm. Another rooster calls through the bright morning air. The settlement fully wakes now. Everyone works, nobody idle. You pause briefly beside the fence line, breathing clouds of steam into the cold atmosphere. Beyond the barns and cabins, fields stretch outward beneath pale sunlight, frozen now, but waiting for spring planting months ahead. The land feels enormous, almost endless. Many settlers arriving westward during the 19th century imagined frontier life bringing independence and prosperity quickly. Reality often involved crushing labor, repeated crop failures, and physical exhaustion severe enough to damage bodies permanently by middle age. You head toward the woodshed carrying a small axe. More firewood needs splitting already. Always more. Inside the shed, stacked logs release sharp pine and cedar scents into the cold air. Wood chips scatter beneath your boots while frost clings against the rough interior walls. You position the first log carefully, then swing. The axe strikes with a solid cracking sound that echoes through the yard. Splinters leap sideways across packed dirt while the split pieces tumble apart cleanly. Again and again. Soon your shoulders burn beneath heavy wool layers. Heat builds inside your coat despite the freezing air surrounding you. Sweat begins forming beneath your collar, creating the uncomfortable frontier problem settlers knew constantly during winter labor. Too cold standing still. Too hot while working. A curious historical tidbit appears repeatedly in old frontier accounts involving accidental cabin fires started by overheated workers drying sweat-soaked clothing too close to open flames. Entire homes occasionally vanished within minutes during harsh winters because exhausted settlers fell asleep beside dangerous fires. You stop briefly to catch your breath. The world around you sounds busy now. Axes striking timber. Livestock moving inside barns. Voices drifting between cabins. Children running across frozen ground. Every sound blends together beneath the pale winter sky into something almost comforting. Frontier mornings carried hardship certainly, but also rhythm. Shared effort connected settlements together through routine labour repeated day after day. Historians continue debating whether frontier communities truly enjoyed stronger social bonds than crowded eastern cities during the same period. Some evidence suggests isolation encouraged cooperation and mutual dependence. Other records reveal bitter disputes over land supplies and survival. Probably both happened. Human nature travels everywhere. You gather the newly split firewood into your arms and begin carrying it toward the cabin once more. Smoke rises steadily from the chimney now, while sunlight reflects brightly against the frost-covered yard. The day has barely begun, yet your muscles already feel tired. And somewhere deep inside, you realize settlers measured time differently than modern people. Not by clocks or schedules exactly, but by chores completed before darkness returned once again. By the time breakfast truly begins, the cabin already feels lived in for half a day. Your arms carry the dull ache of hauling water and splitting wood. Smoke clings heavily to your clothes. Bits of straw stick near your boots from the barn floor. Outside, the pale winter sun has finally risen above the distant fields, though it offers almost no warmth. Inside, the fire snaps softly. That sound comforts everyone. You settle carefully onto the bench beside the rough wooden table while steam drifts upward from bowls of hot cornmeal mush. The smell is plain, but feeling earthy and slightly sweet beneath the sharper scent of salt pork frying nearby. Nobody waits formally to eat. Food disappears quickly here. You wrap cold fingers around a dented tin spoon. The metal feels icy at first, despite the heat rising from breakfast. Beside you, someone slices dark bread into uneven pieces, while another pours coffee carefully to avoid spilling precious grounds. The coffee smells strong today. That usually means supplies arrive recently from town. Trade routes connected even distant settlements to eastern goods by the 1880s, although transportation remained unreliable during harsh weather. Coffee, sugar, flour, lamp oil and nails often travelled enormous distances before finally reaching isolated farms. You lift the first spoonful slowly. The cornmeal tastes thick and warm. Not exciting, not terrible either. Frontier breakfast focused on endurance rather than pleasure. Families needed enough calories to survive physical labor, stretching from sunrise until darkness. Heavy meals became practical necessities instead of comforting rituals. The salt pork arrives next. Grease glistens along the edges. Its smoky scent immediately fills the cabin, briefly overpowering the ever-present smell of burning wood. Everyone reaches for pieces quickly because preserved meat remained valuable throughout winter months. You chew slowly while listening to conversation drift around the table. A neighbour reportedly lost a wagon wheel near the creek crossing yesterday. Someone else mentions unusual animal tracks beyond the northern fence line. One older man quietly predicts more snow within 3 days because the morning wind feels too still. Nobody laughs at him. Frontier weather predictions often relied upon experience, instinct, and folklore blended together. Some settlers trusted aching joints more than the sky itself when forecasting storms. Others watched bird movements, cloud colours, or unusual livestock behaviour for signs of changing conditions. A lesser-known frontier custom involved hanging onions near cabin windows to absorb sickness during winter illness outbreaks. Certain rural families believed onions darkened visibly when disease lingered nearby. Whether anyone truly trusted this method remains difficult to determine, though references appear surprisingly often in personal writings. You take another sip of coffee. The heat spreads pleasantly through your chest. Children finish eating first because their chores continue immediately afterward. One girl pulls on mittens while swallowing the last bites of bread. A younger boy stuffs extra crust into his coat pocket before anyone notices, probably for later. Hunger followed many frontier families constantly, especially after poor harvest seasons. Agricultural records from the late 19th century reveal repeated struggles with droughts, insects, livestock disease, and unpredictable weather patterns that damaged entire communities at once. You glance toward the frost-coated window. Sunlight reflects brilliantly across the snow as beautiful from indoors, miserable after hours outside. The table itself feels rough beneath your sleeve where years of use have worn grooves into the wood. Tiny knife marks cross the surface in every direction. Candle wax stains remain hardened near one corner from long winter evenings spent sewing or repairing tools. Every object inside the cabin carries signs of labour. Nothing decorative survives long without purpose. A quiet pause settles briefly across the room while people finish breakfast. The only sounds come from spoons scraping bowls, firewood shifting inside the hearth, and wind brushing lightly against the outer walls. The moment feels oddly peaceful. Short-lived though. A growing body of historical research suggests settlers often valued these small pauses deeply because uninterrupted rest remained extremely rare. Even short meals beside warm fires could feel emotionally important after exhausting outdoor work. You wipe your mouth with the back of your hand and lean slightly closer toward the heat. The firelight flickers across hanging coats and patched blankets nearby, giving the cabin a soft golden glow despite the cold pressing outside. Someone begins discussing supplies needed from town. Lamp oil, more flour, maybe nails. Always nails. Buying goods cost money many farming families struggle to spare. Broken tools were repaired repeatedly instead of replaced. Handles became shorter over time from constant reshaping. Pots received patches. Boots received layers upon layers of stitching. You noticed the smell of damp wool rising from coats drying beside the fire. Wet leather too. And smoke. Always smoke. One younger child starts nodding sleepily near the table despite the noisy room. Exhaustion came early for frontier children because they worked from remarkably young ages. Some historians believe rural childhood during this era aged people emotionally much faster than modern childhoods, though measuring such experiences remains complicated. The fire suddenly pops loudly. Everyone looks briefly. A shower of sparks rises inside the hearth before settling again into glowing embers. Tiny moments like that commanded attention because cabin fires pose constant dangers throughout frontier settlements. Many homes vanished within minutes after accidental sparks reached dry bedding or roof materials. Winter made those disasters even deadlier. You finish the final bite of breakfast slowly, while warmth from the meal spreads through your body. Outside the cabin windows, neighbouring settlers continue moving across snowy yards carrying tools, feed, buckets and chopped timber. Nobody stays indoors long, not if work waits. The table begins clearing quickly now. Bowls stack together beside the wash basin while leftover grease gets saved carefully for future cooking. Even coffee grounds might dry for reuse later depending upon supply levels. Waste feels almost sinful here. You rise from the bench reluctantly, already sensing cold air waiting outside the door once more. The brief comfort of breakfast fades quickly beneath thoughts of the long working day ahead. Fields need attention. Fences need repair. Animals need feeding again before sunset. And across the frontier in 1880, America, thousands of settlers step away from breakfast fires each morning knowing the hardest part of the day has barely begun. The warmth of breakfast disappears almost immediately once you prepare for the outdoors again. You stand beside the fire, pulling layer after layer across your body while cold drafts slip through tiny gaps between cabin logs. Wool scratches against your neck. Thick socks bunch awkwardly inside stiff boots. Your coat smells faintly of smoke, horse sweat, and old winter air trapped deep within the fabric. Nothing feels comfortable. Comfort is not the goal. Survival is. You button the heavy coat slowly while another family member wraps a scarf across their mouth against the freezing wind outside. Nearby children struggle with oversized gloves and worn bootlaces stiffened by mud and frost. Dressing takes time here, especially during winter. A close examination of frontier life reveals settlers often owned very small wardrobes compared to modern standards. One sturdy coat might last several years through repeated patching and repair. Clothing became tools as important as axes or plows. You pull your hat lower across your ears, immediately warmer, though not by much. The cabin smells crowded now with damp wool leather smoke and lingering breakfast grease. Steam still curls faintly from the wash basin while the fire continues crackling behind the iron grate. Nobody lingers beside it. Too dangerous. Too tempting. You gather thick gloves hanging from a wooden peg near the doorway. The leather feels hard from repeated freezing and thawing. One finger seam has split open, slightly exposing rough stitching repaired by hand weeks earlier. Nearly everything in Frontier homes carried repairs, visible ones. You finally open the cabin door. Cold air rushes inward, instantly making the fire flicker sharply behind you. The outside world appears blindingly bright after the dim golden cabin light. Snow reflects pale sunlight across the yard while icy wind brushes against your face like cold water. Your nose stings immediately. Your breath clouds the air. You step carefully across packed snow towards the wagon shed beside the barn. The ground crunches beneath your boots with a dry, brittle sound that seems louder in winter silence. A horse nickers softly nearby. Chains rattle somewhere farther off. The settlement continues moving through its morning rhythm. Smoke drifts upward from chimneys while settlers cross frozen yards carrying tools over their shoulders. Nobody wastes movement. Even walking appears purposeful here. You reach the wagon shed and pause briefly beneath its slanted roof. Hanging harnesses sway gently from wooden hooks while coils of rope rest beside sacks of feed stacked against the wall. The leather smell feels thick inside, sharp and earthy. You run gloved fingers along a horse harness checking cracked straps and frozen buckles carefully. Winter damaged equipment constantly. Moisture stiffened leather. Ice weakened wagon wheels. Metal fittings snapped unexpectedly during severe cold. Many settlers became skilled repair workers simply because replacement goods remained expensive or unavailable. Blacksmiths held enormous importance within frontier communities for that reason. A broken tool without nearby repair options could halt essential work entirely. You lift a heavy wool blanket from a wooden crate nearby. Horse blankets. Even animals needed extra protection during harsh weather. A curious detail from frontier records describes some settlers sewing old quilts directly onto horse coverings during brutal winters, especially after supply shortages. Appearance mattered little once temperatures dropped dangerously low. You carry the blanket toward the barn while the wind whistles softly across the open fields beyond the settlement. The sky remains clear now, though pale winter sunlight still offers almost no heat against your exposed cheeks. Inside the barn, warmth gathers slightly beneath the roof. The horses turn their heads as you enter. Their breath rises around them in slow white clouds while bits of hay cling to their coats. One large brown mare nudges your shoulder, impatiently searching for attention or food. Possibly both. You drape the wool blanket carefully across her back. The coarse fabric smells dusty from storage, though the horse immediately settles beneath its added warmth. Animals shaped daily frontier routines more than many modern people realize. Horses hauled wagons, plows, timber, water barrels, and sometimes entire families across enormous distances. Without healthy animals, isolated settlers risked losing contact with nearby towns entirely. You tighten a loose strap carefully. Cold metal bites through your gloves. Nearby, another settler examines wagon wheels resting against the barn wall. Frozen wood occasionally cracked without warning during winter travel, creating dangerous situations far from help. Conversations remain brief this morning, mostly practical. The weather, road conditions, tool repairs. A quieter understanding of frontier life emerges slowly as you watch these movements repeat across the barn. Settlers rarely dressed for appearance or individuality during working hours. Clothing existed almost entirely for protection. Heavy fabric shielded skin from wind snow, splinters, mud, and sparks from open fires. Beauty came second. Function came first. You step back outside carrying a small sack of nails and a hammer needed for fence repairs later. The metal tools feel shockingly cold even through thick gloves. Frost glitters across nearby fence posts while distant crows gather along bare tree branches near the frozen fields. Their calls sound rough and hollow, almost lonely. Some frontier communities believed crows gathering unusually close to homes signaled approaching storms or illness. Folklore spread quickly across isolated settlements because people searched constantly for patterns offering even tiny feelings of certainty. You glance toward neighboring cabins where other settlers continue preparing for long hours outdoors. One woman shakes frozen rugs beside her porch. A boy drags chopped timber toward a woodshed nearly his own height. Everyone carries something. Everyone works. Academic discussions surrounding frontier hardship often focus heavily upon men farming fields or driving cattle. Yet surviving records increasingly reveal how entire households shared exhausting responsibilities. Women repaired clothing late into the night. Children hauled water through snowstorms. Elderly relatives watched livestock or prepared meals despite aching joints and poor health. No hands remained idle for long. The wind shifts again across the settlement, carrying smells of smoke, manure, and frozen earth together into the bright winter air. Somewhere nearby an axe strikes wood in slow, deliberate rhythm. You pull your coat tighter. The day still stretches ahead endlessly. Your clothing feels heavy now, with layered wool and leather pressing against every movement. Yet without these rough protective layers, even ordinary chores could become dangerous before noon. That reality settles quietly into your thoughts as you step farther into the frozen morning, dressed not for comfort or style, but simply for another day of enduring frontier life. You leave the cluster of cabins behind and walk slowly toward the open fields. Snow crunches beneath your boots while pale sunlight stretches across the frozen ground in long silver bands. The settlement grows quieter behind you with every step, though faint sounds still drift through the cold air. A hammer striking wood, a distant horse calling from the barn, someone shouting briefly across a fence line. Then mostly wind. The fields wait ahead, wide and still. Your breath rises steadily as you follow a narrow path hardened by repeated footsteps and wagon wheels. Frozen mud forms uneven ridges beneath the sow, forcing careful movement across the rough ground. The air smells different away from the cabins, cleaner perhaps, though the scent of frozen soil lingers faintly beneath the cold. You pull your gloves tighter while approaching the fenced farmland surrounding the settlement. Wooden posts stand crooked in several places where recent windstorms loosened the earth before freezing temperatures returned again. Fence repairs never truly ended. Nothing on the frontier stayed finished for long. You pause near the edge of a field where dead cornstalks still poke through thin layers of snow. Their dry leaves rattle softly whenever the wind shifts. Beyond them stretches empty land, fading gradually into pale winter haze. It feels endless out here. A little intimidating, honestly. Many settlers arriving west believed frontier soil would provide easy prosperity simply because land appeared abundant. Yet farming across unfamiliar terrain demanded brutal persistence. Harsh winters, droughts, insects, and sudden storms ruined countless families financially before they fully established themselves. You kneel beside a damaged fence post carrying a small sack of nails and a hammer from earlier. Frost clings along the wood grain while loose wire sags toward the frozen earth. The metal burns cold against your gloves. You begin working carefully. Each hammer strike echoes sharply across the quiet field. Tiny vibrations travel through your arms into your shoulders while nearby crows scatter upward from the fence line, flapping noisily into the pale sky. The work feels repetitive, because it is. Much of frontier life involved maintenance instead of progress. Settlers repaired what weather destroyed, protected what animals threatened, and repeated the same exhausting routines every season. A surviving collection of frontier diaries from the late 19th century reveals constant frustration over fencing alone. Livestock wandered through weak sections, storms snapped posts, frozen ground complicated repairs for months during winter. You straighten slowly, rubbing stiffness from your hands. Cold air creeps through your sleeves despite the heavy coat. Farther down the field, another settler guides a horse pulling a simple wooden sled loaded with timber. The animal moves steadily through packed snow while harness chains clink softly with each step. No engines, no machines humming, only muscle and patience. You continue along the fence line, searching for additional weak sections. Dry grass pokes through snow in tangled patches around your boots while icy wind brushes steadily across the open land. The sound out here feels different than near the cabins, larger somehow. The wind moves uninterrupted across enormous distances, creating low hollow tones around the fence posts and frozen weeds. Occasionally a crow calls overhead or distant livestock break the silence. Otherwise, the prairie simply breathes around you. A lesser-known detail from frontier farming communities involved settlers planting strips of fast-growing trees near fields whenever possible. These windbreaks helped reduce soil erosion and offered slight shelter against relentless prairie winds. Many early attempts failed because young trees struggled terribly in harsh conditions. You stop briefly beside a wagon rut frozen solid into the earth. The track remains deep even beneath the snow. Heavy wagons shape the landscape constantly during westward settlement. Roads often form naturally from repeated travel rather than careful planning. During wet seasons, those same roads transformed into thick mud, capable of trapping wagons for hours. Today, the ground feels hard as stone. You continue walking toward a small storage shed near the far edge of the property. Its roof sags slightly beneath old snow while weathered boards creak gently whenever wind presses against them. Inside smells of grain dust and old wood. You set down the tool sack and inspect several farming implements hanging along the wall. Iron plough parts catch thin beams of winter sunlight filtering through cracks between boards. Rust spots spread across neglected metal surfaces despite careful maintenance efforts. Agricultural equipment remained enormously expensive for many frontier families. Some neighbours shared tools seasonally because purchasing separate machinery proved impossible. Others repaired broken implements repeatedly long after they should have been replaced. You pick up a shovel leaning against the wall. Its handle feels smooth from years' view. Outside again, the sunlight has shifted higher into the pale sky, though the temperature still bites sharply across exposed skin. Your cheeks burn slightly from wind and cold together. The field appears beautiful now, quiet, bright. Yet beneath that beauty lies constant anxiety familiar to nearly every farming family across the frontier. Would next year's crop survive? Would livestock remain healthy? Would drought arrive again? Those worries never disappeared completely. Some scholars examining frontier settlement patterns suggest emotional stress and uncertainty affected settlers more deeply than early historians recognized. Letters and journals frequently mention exhaustion, sleeplessness, and loneliness alongside an ordinary labor description. You lean briefly against the repaired fence while watching snow drift lightly across the open field surface. Tiny crystals swirl through the sunlight before disappearing again against the white ground. For a moment, everything seems still. Then the wind returns harder. Your coat snaps softly against your legs while cold air pushes through every small opening around your collar and glove. The frontier never lets you forget the weather for very long. You gather your tools once more and begin heading back toward the settlement. Smoke continues rising from cabin chimneys in the distance while dark figures move steadily between barns and sheds. From here, the homes appear small, fragile almost. A scattered collection of wooden structures standing against enormous land and endless weather. And yet settlers remained here year after year, walking these frozen fields each morning. Trusting hard work might somehow hold uncertainty back for one more season. By late morning, the cold settles differently into your body. It no longer shocks you. Instead, it lingers quietly beneath your clothing while your muscles warm through constant movement. The frontier has a strange way of teaching endurance through repetition alone. You carry the axe back toward the woodshed while pale sunlight glows weakly across the frozen settlement. Smoke drifts steadily from cabin chimneys, and the air smells richly of pine sap ash and damp earth hidden beneath snow. The woodshed waits half full, which means trouble eventually. Firewood controlled nearly every part of daily life in 1880 America. Without enough, wood cabins turned dangerous after sunset. Meals could not be cooked properly. Wet clothing stayed damp. Water froze solid inside buckets before dawn. A surprising number of frontier diaries mention fear of running out of fuel more often than fear of wild animals. You place another log onto the chopping block. The surface already bears deep scars from years of use. Then you swing. The axe lands with a thick cracking sound that echoes through the yard. Fresh wood splits apart, cleanly releasing sharp resin scents into the icy air. Tiny fragments scatter across your boots. Again and again. Soon your breathing grows heavier beneath the scarf covering your mouth. Heat builds inside your coat despite the bitter cold outside. Sweat gathers along your neck while steam rises faintly from your shoulders. Frontier labor rarely looked dramatic, mostly repetitive, still exhausting. An observation repeated across many historical accounts describes how settlers spent astonishing portions of their lives gathering, cutting, stacking, transporting, and burning wood. Entire family schedules often revolved around maintaining fuel supplies before winter storms arrived. You pause briefly and lean against the axe handle. The silence feels larger now. The morning rush around the settlement has softened into steady rhythms. Somewhere nearby, a saw grinds slowly through timber. A horse snorts inside the barn. Faint voices drift from another homestead farther down the road. Otherwise, only wind. A younger boy approaches carrying an armful of smaller branches for kindling. His boots appear slightly too large, causing awkward heavy footsteps across the packed snow. He says little. Most children learned quickly that work happened faster without constant talking. You kneel beside the woodpile and begin sorting thinner pieces from larger logs. The bark feels rough beneath your gloves, while loose snow melts slowly against the warm leather palms. Nearby stacked timber rises nearly as tall as the cabin wall. Still not enough. Never enough. Families throughout frontier regions often estimated winter survival partly by the size of their woodpile. Visitors quietly judged preparation levels during cold season simply by looking beside a cabin. One unusual practice from certain northern settlements involved covering stacked firewood with old animal hides during severe snowstorms. Some families believed this preserved dryness better than cloth coverings alone, though evidence remains scattered and inconsistent. You straighten slowly, stretching aching shoulders while the boy carries another load toward the porch. The smell of fresh split cedar drifts strongly through the yard, now mixing with smoke from the chimney overhead. It smells oddly comforting, even luxurious in a way. You lift another heavy log onto the chopping block, or this one resists more stubbornly, forcing repeated strikes before finally splitting apart unevenly. Your arms vibrate afterward. Tiny aches everywhere. A closer reading of frontier medical records suggests chronic physical pain became deeply normalized among settlers. Back injuries, stiff joints, frost-damaged fingers, and muscle strain appeared constantly in personal writings, often described casually rather than dramatically. Pain belonged to ordinary life here. You glance toward the cabin window where movement flickers behind frosted glass. Someone inside likely prepares midday bread or mends clothing beside the fire. Indoor work carried its own endless demands, even if it looked less brutal from a distance. The wind changes direction suddenly. Colder now. Now, it pushes loose snow across the yard in thin silver streaks, while tree branches creak softly near the edge of the settlement. You pull your scarf higher and return to splitting logs before your hands stiffen too badly. The rhythm becomes strangely hypnotic after a while. Lift, swing, crack, stack, repeat. Your mind begins drifting during the repetition. You notice details otherwise ignored during busier moments. Frost patterns climbing the fence rails, ravens circling high above the fields, smoke bending sideways beneath the shifting wind. Time stretches differently during physical labor, slower perhaps, yet somehow emptier too. Some modern historians examining frontier psychology suggest repetitive outdoor work occasionally produced calming mental effects despite harsh conditions. Long hours of chopping wood, walking fields, or tending livestock created quiet spaces for thought uncommon in crowded industrial cities of the same era. Of course, exhaustion helped silence people too. You kneel beside the growing stack and brush snow from your gloves. Nearby, the younger boy now struggles, dragging a heavier log across the frozen ground. He grunts softly with effort, but refuses to ask for assistance. Pride starts young here. You step forward and lift the opposite end without comment. Together you drag the log beside the chopping block while cold air burns inside your lungs. The child nods once before hurrying back toward the woodshed again. No thank you needed. Shared labor replaces many words on the frontier. A crow lands atop the fence nearby, tilting its head curiously while watching the activity below. His dark feathers stand sharply against the bright snow. For a brief moment everything stills. Then another axe strike sounds from a neighbouring yard, followed by barking dogs somewhere beyond the road. The settlement breathes constantly through labour. You gather another armful of split wood and carry it toward the cabin porch. The logs feel heavy but satisfying against your arms. Their rough bark scratches your sleeves while pine resin leaves sticky traces along your gloves. Inside the cabin, those same logs will soon become warmth-hot meals, drying clothes and light flickering against tired faces after sunset. Out here they are simply work, necessary work, and as the pale winter morning slowly approaches noon, you realize frontier life depended less upon dramatic adventures than relentless ordinary tasks repeated faithfully every single day. While the chopping continues outside, another kind of labor unfolds quietly inside the cabin. It rarely stops. You push open the door, carrying fresh firewood against your chest while warm, smoky air rushes across your face. The sudden heat almost feels overwhelming after standing in the wind for so long. Your boots leave melting snow near the doorway. Someone sighs at the sight immediately. Mud and water inside frontier homes created endless frustration because floors rarely stayed clean for more than a few minutes. Dirt followed every chore back indoors. The cabin feels busier now than earlier this morning. Not louder exactly, just full. A kettle bubbles gently over the fire while strips of damp clothing hang beside the hearth, drying slowly in the rising warmth. The smell inside blends smoke-wet wool bread dough and faint traces of animal scent carried indoors from the barn. You set the wood beside the fireplace. A woman kneels nearby, rolling dough across the rough table surface. Ooh. Her sleeves remain pushed high above reddened wrists dusted lightly with flour. Beside her, another family member repairs torn clothing beneath the window where winter sunlight falls strongest. Needlework never truly ends here. Neither does cooking, nor cleaning, nor hauling water. Modern retellings of frontier life often focus heavily upon wagon journeys, farming, or dramatic survival stories. Yet household labor consumed enormous portions of daily existence, particularly for women responsible for feeding, washing, sewing, preserving food, raising children, and maintaining warmth inside crowded cabins. You sit briefly near the wall, pulling off damp gloves. Your fingers throb softly as warmth returns. The woman at the table continues kneading dough with slow practice movements. The dough sticks slightly against the wood before folding inward again beneath her palms. The rhythm looks calming, probably exhausting after hours. Nearby, a younger girl scrubs iron cookware inside a basin of cloudy water. Steam rises around her face while she works stubbornly at hardened grease clinging to the pan surface. The metal squeals faintly, an unpleasant sound. A fascinating detail preserved in several frontier memoirs describes women sometimes saving bacon grease inside ceramic containers for dozens of different uses. Grease-flavored meals softened leather, helped season cookware, and occasionally even treated cracked skin during severe winters. Nothing useful disappeared casually. The cabin window rattles softly beneath a gust of wind outside. Firelight flickers across the ceiling beams while shadows shift around hanging coats and stacked blankets. You notice the constant movement now. Somebody stirring soup, somebody mending socks, somebody carrying water. Frontier households operated almost continuously from before sunrise until late evening. Periods of true rest remained uncommon, especially during winter months when indoor work expanded alongside outdoor responsibilities. The smell of yeast rises warmly from the dough beside the table. Comforting somehow. Even simple bread feels important here. You lean back against the wall, while another patch of clothing passes between careful fingers beside the window. The fabric appears worn, nearly transparent in places after repeated repairs. Store-bought clothing existed by 1880, especially near rail lines and larger towns. But many rural families still relied heavily upon homemade garments. Sewing skills carried real survival value because replacing clothing cost money difficult to spare. A small child wanders too close to the fire briefly, immediately redirected. Open flames demanded constant attention inside wooden cabins crowded with fabric straw bedding and dry timber walls. Entire settlements occasionally vanished after single accidental fires spread during windy conditions. The kettle lid rattles softly now. Steam curls upward. Someone adds dried herbs into a simmering pot hanging over the hearth. Their scent drifts slowly through the room, earthy and slightly bitter. Many frontier remedies blended practical medicine with tradition and guesswork. Mint teas soothed stomach pain. Onion syrup supposedly helped coughs. Goose grease appeared in countless homemade treatments for chest illness despite uncertain effectiveness. Researchers studying rural medical traditions still disagree about how many folk remedies genuinely helped settlers versus simply offering emotional comfort during illness. Perhaps both mattered. You watch the girl beside the wash basin wring water from a cloth using small reddened hands. Her sleeves remain damp nearly to the elbows, while cold light from the window reflects against the water surface. Laundry alone consumes astonishing effort. Water needed hauling, heating, scrubbing, rinsing, drying. Winter complicated every stage. Some women reportedly froze clothing stiff outdoors intentionally before beating dirt from fabric with sticks. Whether this cleaned garments effectively remains unclear, though references appear in several northern frontier accounts. The fire pops sharply. Everyone glances over instinctively. Then work resumes immediately. You notice another loaf already rising beneath cloth near the hearth, while strips of salted meat hang from ceiling hooks above the table. Every available space inside the cabin serves some practical purpose. Storage, drying, cooking, repair. The frontier leaves little room for decoration. Still, small personal touches appear quietly throughout the cabin if you look carefully enough. A faded ribbon tied beside the window, a carved wooden spoon hanging near the stove, a pressed flower tucked between cracks in the wall beam. Tiny reminders of beauty, tiny acts of stubborn humanity. Outside, faint axe strikes continue from neighbouring yards while distant wagon wheels creak across frozen roads leading toward town. Yet indoors the sounds feel softer. Fabric rustling, water pouring, bread dough pressing against wood. The work inside carries a different rhythm, less visible, perhaps, but equally relentless. You stand again and move toward the doorway carrying another empty water bucket. The warmth near the fire has begun making your heavy coat feel almost suffocating after the cold outdoors. Before leaving, you glance once more around the busy cabin. The bending figures, the steaming kettles, the endless repairing and preparing, and you begin understanding something frontier records rarely stated directly. Survival on the frontier did not depend only upon dramatic courage or physical strength. Often it depended upon quiet, invisible labour repeated faithfully every single day inside cabins just like this one. The bucket feels heavier now than it did this morning. Perhaps your arms are limply tired, or perhaps the cold has settled deeper into your muscles after hours of work. Either way, you carry the water carefully across the snowy yard while children move quickly around you, completing chores of their own. Nobody treats childhood gently here. The frontier cannot afford to. A small boy drags a sack of feed nearly half his size toward the chicken pen. Nearby, two girls carry laundry from the clothes iron before fresh snow arrives again. Their cheeks glow red from cold wind while damp strands of hair escape beneath wool scarves. None of them move slowly. They learned early. You stop near the porch and watch quietly for a moment. The younger boy struggles lifting the feed sack over the fence rail before finally managing with a frustrated grunt. The chickens rush toward him instantly, flapping and pecking around his boots. He looks exhausted already, and the day remains young. Accounts from rural America during the late 19th century frequently reveal children working long before reaching adulthood. Farm families depended heavily upon younger household members for labour, because hiring outside help cost money many settlers simply did not possess. You set the water bucket down beside the doorway. The wooden handle has carved saw lines into your palm. Nearby, another child pumps water into a trough while shivering beneath an oversized coat clearly handed down through older siblings. The sleeves hang too long over small hands, forcing awkward, stiff movements with every task. Hand-me-down shaped frontier childhood. Clothing rarely belonged permanently to one child. Inside the barn, you hear quick footsteps across packed hay. A pair of boys work together, carrying smaller wood bundles toward the stable wall, while horses watch with slow blinking eyes from their stalls. The air inside smells thick and warm compared to outdoors. Hay, leather, dust, animal breath. One boy sneezes loudly into his sleeve before continuing immediately back to work. Nobody pauses long for discomfort unless injury or illness becomes severe. A number of personal letters from frontier communities mention children losing baby teeth while ploughing fields, carrying water or milking cows, because work rarely stopped for small milestones. Ordinary life simply continued around them. You lean briefly against a wooden beam, watching the boys stack kindling near the barn stove. Their movements appear practiced despite their age. Efficient, a little serious. Play existed on the frontier, certainly, but usually around work rather than separate from it. Children raced while hauling water buckets, they joked while gathering eggs. Games appeared during moments already shaped by chores and responsibility. One strange rural belief from certain Midwestern communities claimed children should never whistle indoors during winter, because it supposedly invited strong winds into the house. Some parents repeated the warning seriously, while others likely used it simply to preserve quiet inside crowded cabins. The barn door creaks open suddenly. Cold light spills across the floor. A girl enters carrying cracked corn in a metal pail, while snowflakes cling to the hem of her skirt. She walks directly toward the chicken crates near the back wall without speaking. Everyone already understands the routine. The sounds inside the barn settle into steady patterns. Grain pouring into troughs, horses chewing hay, boots scraping frozen dirt from the floorboards. Somewhere above, pigeons flutter nervously near the rafters. You notice the children's hands closely now. Red knuckles, dry skin, tiny cuts. Winter labour aged hands quickly regardless of age. Frost-cracked skin painfully during repeated exposure to icy water, rough wood and freezing wind. Gloves helped somewhat, though cheaper pairs often stiffened with moisture before noon. A recent historical interpretation of frontier family life suggests rural children developed unusually strong practical skills compared to urban counterparts during the same period. By 10 or 12 years old, many could ride horses, manage livestock repair tools, and cook basic meals independently. Necessity taught quickly. You step back outside, carrying another load of split wood toward the cabin. The sky has begun changing subtly overhead. Thin grey clouds spread slowly across the pale blue horizon, while wind moves sharper through the open fields. A younger child runs past chasing a loose chicken. Brief laughter follows. Then work resumes immediately afterward. That rhythm feels important somehow. Even in difficult conditions, small moments of playfulness survive naturally between responsibilities. Frontier life did not erase joy entirely, it simply buried joy beneath layers of labour and fatigue. Near the well, two sisters now struggle lifting heavy water buckets together. Their boots slide across packed snow while cold water splashes against their skirts. You move toward them instinctively. One smiles with visible relief. The buckets feel painfully heavy even in your hands. Researchers still debate how frontier childhood shaped emotional development later in life. Some evidence points toward unusual resilience and independence among rural adults raised this way. Other records reveal deep exhaustion, limited education, and physical hardship beginning far too early. Probably both truths existed side by side. The girls thank you quietly before hurrying toward the cabin with the water. Their breath rises in pale clouds behind them while smoke curls steadily upward from the chimney overhead. You remain beside the well briefly, listening. The settlement hums with constant activity now. Axes striking timber. Dogs barking beyond the fields. Wagon wheels groaning somewhere down the frozen road toward town. And among all those sounds move children, working, carrying, repairing, learning adulthood far earlier than modern childhood would ever demand. As cold wind brushes across your face once more, you begin realizing frontier survival depended not only upon strong adults, but upon entire families shaped around labor, from the moment children could walk steadily enough to help. By midday, the settlement moves more slowly, not because the work has ended, because exhaustion has already begun settling into everyone's body. The bright winter sun hangs pale above the fields, while cold wind drifts steadily across the open land, carrying loose snow through wagon tracks and fence posts. Your stomach growls again. Frontier labour burns through breakfast quickly. You walk toward the edge of the property where a small wagon waits beside stacked timber and bundled tools. Nearby, several settlers gather quietly for the midday meal, brushing snow from coats before sitting along overturned crates and rough wooden boards. Nobody speaks loudly. Energy feels too precious. The smell of food drifts softly through the cold air. Salted pork again, bread wrapped in cloth. Weak coffee reheated over portable coals. One man slices dried apples into a tin bowl while another unwraps smoked meat from waxed paper already stained with grease. Simple food. Heavy food. Necessary food. You settle onto a low wooden crate beside the wagon wheel. The wood feels frozen even through your coat layers. Nearby horses stand patiently beneath wool blankets, their breath rising in slow white clouds around dark noses and frost-covered reins. The entire scene feels muted somehow. Quiet chewing, quiet conversation, quiet fatigue. A broad survey of rural American settlements from the late 19th century shows midday meals were often brief practical pauses rather than long social gatherings. Winter daylight disappeared early, and settlers guarded working hours carefully whenever weather allowed outdoor labour. You accept a thick slice of bread from a nearby basket. The crust feels hard but warm near the centre. Steam escapes faintly as you break it apart with cold, stiff fingers. The smell reminds you briefly of the cabin earlier, with its firelight and rising dough beside the hearth. One older farmer complains softly about frozen fence posts splitting after last week's storm. Another mentions rumours of railroad expansion farther west. The conversation drifts slowly. Half practical, half speculative. Out here news travels unevenly. A traveller passing through town might carry stories from hundreds of miles away. Some arrive accurate. Others grow stranger with every retelling. A particularly odd frontier rumour once circulated through parts of Kansas, claiming certain prairie lights appearing at night were wandering spirits protecting hidden gold deposits beneath the plains. Years later, some settlers admitted the lights likely came from distant lanterns or swamp gases, though not everyone abandoned the story completely. You sip lukewarm coffee carefully. The bitterness wakes you slightly. Nearby, one horse stomps impatiently against the frozen ground while harness buckles clink softly in the wind. The smell of leather mixes with cold air and wood smoke drifting faintly from nearby chimneys. Your hands ache less now, your shoulders more. That balance changes constantly during frontier work. A younger settler unwraps strips of dried venison beside you while brushing snow from his sleeves. His gloves appear patched repeatedly near the fingertips where leather wore thin from constant labour. Almost everything shows wear here. Coats, tools, people. A growing number of historians examining frontier nutrition believe many rural settlers lived in a near-constant cycle of physical depletion during harsh seasons. Long labour hours combined with limited winter diets often left people exhausted even while appearing outwardly sturdy. Still, meals like this carried emotional value beyond simple survival. The brief pause near other people, the warmth of shared food, and the momentary stillness beside working wagons all offered small relief from endless chores. You glance across the open fields. Clouds have thickened slightly overhead. Thin shadows drift slowly across the snow while distant crows gather beside the frozen creek beyond the settlement. Their dark shapes move sharply against the pale landscape. Someone nearby begins telling a story about wolves spotted near a ranch several miles north. Nobody interrupts. Stories matter during pauses like this. The details grow larger with each retelling. The wolves become bigger, the snowfall deeper, the danger closer. Frontier conversations often blended fact, memory, exaggeration, and boredom into one shared form of entertainment. You chew slowly while listening. The pork tastes smoky and salty enough to dry your mouth almost immediately. Another swallow of coffee helps only slightly. Yet nobody complains about the meal itself. Food scarcity remained too familiar. During difficult winters, some isolated families survived largely on coarse bread beans and preserved fat for weeks at a time. Fresh vegetables nearly vanished from many rural diets after autumn harvests ended. The wagon beside you creaks softly whenever wind pushes against its wooden frame. Iron rims surrounding the wheels glint faintly beneath pale sunlight. Snow has gathered inside old cracks along the wagon bed where grain sacks usually rest during warmer months. A child nearby laughs suddenly after slipping on packed snow. The sound feels startlingly bright. Then quieter conversation resumes again. Researchers continue exploring how settlers balanced hardship with ordinary moments of humour and companionship. Personal letters from the period often describe laughter appearing in surprisingly bleak situations, perhaps because humour eased tension in communities constantly facing uncertainty. You finish the last piece of bread and brush crumbs from your gloves. The brief warmth of the meal already fades beneath the sharp afternoon wind. No one lingers long after eating. There is always more work waiting. One man rises slowly while rubbing stiffness from his knees. Another begins checking harness straps beside the horses. Someone else gathers empty tins into a canvas sack before snow can cover them. The pause ends naturally, without announcement. You stand and glance once more across the settlement. Smoke curls upward from cabins in thin grey ribbons, while figures continue moving steadily between barns, sheds and frozen fields. Midday has arrived, yet frontier life offers no true break from labour. Only brief moments beside wagons and winter wind where tired settlers gather together, eat quickly, exchange stories and prepare themselves quietly for the remaining hours before darkness returns once again. The afternoon begins with mud, not dramatic frontier adventure, not heroic struggle against wilderness, just mud everywhere. You step away from the wagon gathering and then immediately feel your boots sink through a thin layer of snow into dark frozen slush beneath. Cold water presses against the leather while sticky earth clings heavily to the sole. The frontier never stays clean for long, no matter how hard people try. You walk back toward the cabins where narrow paths between buildings have transformed into churned mixtures of snow manure, ash and frozen dirt. Wagons grind deep tracks into the ground while livestock leave scattered droppings across nearly every yard. The smell shifts constantly here. Smoke, wet earth, animal waste, cooked grease, sweat hidden beneath wool coats. A detailed examination of rural settlements from this period shows sanitation remained one of frontier life's most exhausting daily struggles. Dirt entered cabins continuously through boots, tools, firewood animals, and weather itself. You scrape your boots against a wooden step before entering the cabin again. It barely helped me. Inside, the warmth feels softer than earlier. Afternoon light filters dimly through the frosted windows while firewood crackles steadily in the hearth. Yet even here, signs of the outdoors cover nearly everything. Mud near the doorway, ash beside the stove, dust floating through the sunlight. A woman kneels near the floor, scrubbing stubborn stains from rough wooden planks using heated water and a rag already dark with dirt. Her shoulders move slowly with visible fatigue. The floor will not stay clean. Still she scrubs. Settlers often cleaned constantly, despite knowing the results would vanish within hours. Cleanliness carried practical importance because sickness spread rapidly through crowded homes lacking modern plumbing or waste systems. You remove your coat slowly near the fire. Steam rises faintly from damp wool. Across the room, a younger child shakes dirt from blankets before folding them tightly beside the wall. Another wipes soot from cookware hanging above the hearth while coughing lightly through the smoky air. Smoke never fully leaves frontier homes. It settles into everything. Some rural households attempted unusual methods for controlling indoor smells during winter. Dried lavender cedar branches or apple peels were occasionally burned near fireplaces to improve cabin air, though such luxuries depended heavily upon local resources and family income. You kneel near the wash basin and rinse mud from your hands. The water already looks cloudy despite repeated changes throughout the day. Tiny flakes of ash drift across the surface while soap leaves greasy streaks near the edges. The water cools quickly, too quickly. A nearby broom leans against the wall, handmade from bundled straw tied tightly with rough cord. Sweeping happens repeatedly throughout the day because dirt arrives faster than anyone can remove it. Outside, wind rattles the window softly. Loose snow brushes against the cabin wall. You glance upward toward the ceiling beams, blackened by years of smoke exposure. Small cobwebs cling near the corners despite regular cleaning efforts. Tiny particles of dust float lazily through the firelight. Nothing here feels polished, only maintained. A thoughtful reading of frontier household journals suggests many settlers judged homes less by appearance and more by functionality. A clean enough cabin, warm enough fire, and dry enough bedding often counted as genuine success during difficult seasons. You step toward the doorway again, carrying a bucket of dirty water outside for dumping. The cold air strikes your face sharply after the cabin warmth while your boots crunch across dirty snow near the porch. You pour the water carefully. Grey slush spreads immediately across the frozen ground. Nearby pigs root noisily beside a fence line, searching for scraps beneath packed snow. Their coarse bodies move through mud without hesitation, splattering dark earth against the wooden rails. Animals contribute heavily to the settlement's constant filth. Necessary animals, still filthy. One dog trots past carrying something unidentifiable in its mouth before disappearing behind the barn. Children shout somewhere beyond the sheds while wagon wheels creak faintly along the road leading towards town. You notice how quickly dirt returns even after cleaning. Fresh footprints already mark the porch. Mud gathers again near the path. Ash drifts from the chimney onto snow that looked pristine only hours earlier. The frontier constantly pushes against order. Some historians studying disease patterns in 19th century rural America believe poor sanitation likely caused far more illness than official records reveal. Many settlers lacked reliable waste disposal systems, and contaminated water remained common in isolated communities. You carry another load of firewood toward the cabin while thin snow begins falling lightly from the grey afternoon sky. The flakes melt almost immediately against your coat sleeves. Inside, the smell of soup simmering over the fire mixes strangely with damp wool and cleaning soap. Someone hangs freshly rinsed cloth near the hearth, while another wipes condensation from the window glass using a faded towel. The work never feels fully complete, only temporarily controlled. A peculiar frontier custom recorded in scattered rural accounts involves spreading fresh pine needles across cabin floors before gatherings or holidays to improve smells and soften rough surfaces. Visitors reportedly appreciated the effort even if the needles eventually became another cleaning problem afterward. You smile slightly, imagining the scene. Brief beauty, temporary beauty. The child near the blankets yawns openly now while continuing to fold fabric beside the wall. Everyone moves a little slower during afternoon hours. Fatigue settles quietly into shoulders, knees, and stiff hands. Still, the chores continue. Because they must. You sit briefly beside the fire and study the room around you once more. The patched clothing, the scrubbed floorboards, the smoke-stained ceiling, the endless effort required simply to keep one small cabin livable through winter. And slowly you understand another hidden truth of frontier life. Settlers did not conquer dirt or hardship completely. They merely fought both every single day and hoped tomorrow would not arrive worse than today. By late afternoon, the settlement begins preparing quietly for evening. Not for rest yet, just for a different kind of labour. The winter sky darkens earlier than expected, turning pale grey above the frozen fields while smoke thickens across the cluster of cabins. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings softly through the cold air. One slow note, then another. The sound carries surprisingly far across open land. You pause near the fence line listening as the final echoes fade into the wind. The bell comes from a modest wooden church standing near the edge of town, small enough that some travellers mistake it for a storage barn from a distance. Yet its presence matters deeply here. Frontier settlements often centred around churches not only for religion, but also for community gatherings, news-sharing weddings, funerals, and moments of human connection during long isolated winters. You begin walking towards a town alongside several other settlers bundled tightly against the growing cold. Boots crunch steadily across frozen wagon tracks while scarves flutter lightly in the evening wind. Nobody rushes. The church gathering feels familiar, predictable, a comfort against uncertainty. As you approach the settlement centre, more figures emerge from side roads and nearby farms carrying lanterns that sway gently through the dimming light. Their yellow glow reflects softly across snow and muddy ground. The church itself appears plain, white paint peeling, steps slightly crooked, windows fogged faintly from warmth inside. Still, people continue arriving. A closer look at rural American life during this period reveals churches often acted as emotional anchors within frontier communities. In isolated regions, weekly gatherings provided rare opportunities to exchange news, discuss hardships, and maintain social bonds beyond immediate family members. You step inside and immediately feel heat from the iron stove near the center of the room. The warmth smells strongly of coal smoke, damp wool, candle wax, and wet boots drying near the doorway. Wooden benches creak beneath shifting bodies. Quiet voices murmur softly. Children fidget beside exhausted parents. The room glows gently beneath oil lamps hanging along the walls. Their light flickers across tired faces lined by wind-cold and years of physical work. Nobody here appears wealthy, but nearly everyone appears determined. You settle onto a bench near the back while snow melts slowly from your boots onto the rough wooden floorboards. Nearby, a woman removes thick gloves and rubs warmth back into reddened fingers. The church bell rings once more outside. Then silence settles. A minister steps forward holding a worn Bible with loose pages tucked carefully inside the cover. His voice begins softly, almost blending with the crackling stove behind him. You listen while the room stills around you. For many frontier settlers, religion offered structure in lives shaped heavily by uncertainty. Crops failed. Illness spread suddenly. Winter storms isolated families for weeks. Faith helped many people endure situations beyond their control. Yet frontier religion could also become strict and deeply judgmental depending upon the community. Small towns remembered everything. One forgotten but fascinating detail from some prairie settlements involved traveling preachers holding services inside barns, saloons, or private cabins whenever churches had not yet been constructed. In certain regions, gambling tables were reportedly pushed aside temporarily before Sunday sermons began. The thought feels strangely human. Improvised faith for improvised lives. The minister continues speaking about endurance, gratitude, and responsibility while wind brushes softly against the church walls outside. His words rise and fall slowly through the warm, dim room. Some people close their eyes while listening. Others stare quietly at the floor. A child nearby struggles not to fall asleep against his mother's shoulder. The stove gives off heavy, dry heat now, carrying faint metallic smells into the crowded room. Wet coats steam lightly near the entrance while candle flames tremble whenever cold drafts slip beneath the doors. Researchers examining frontier communities often note how churches helped reinforce social expectations beyond spiritual matters. Attendance could influence reputations, business relationships, and marriage prospects within smaller settlements where everyone observed each other's behavior closely. You notice that quiet observation happening here too. Who arrived late? Who sits alone? Who whispers during prayer? Communities this small leave little hidden. Still there is comfort in gathering together. After long days of isolation and labour, even simple shared silence feels meaningful after hours spent alone in fields, barns, or cramped cabins. The minister's voice softens near the end of the service, while darkness deepens fully outside the frosted windows. Oil lamps glow warmer now against the growing night. A woman begins singing quietly from the front row. Others join gradually. The hymn fills the small church with tired, uneven voices carrying through the dry winter air. Nobody sounds polished. Some barely remain on tune at all. Yet the sound feels sincere, gentle, human. You listen while the music drifts around the wooden room beside crackling stove heat and rattling window panes. For a few moments, the endless chores, mud, cold, and fatigue outside seem farther away. Not gone, just quieter. A few scholars studying emotional life on the frontier suggest communal rituals like church gatherings helped settlers maintain psychological stability during periods of extreme hardship and isolation. Shared routines offered reassurance that life still possessed meaning beyond survival alone. The final hymn fades slowly. People begin standing carefully. Boots scrape against floorboards while coats and scarves return once again. Quiet conversations spread through the room almost immediately afterward. Weather predictions, crop concerns, news from town. Someone mentions a family several miles east dealing with illness. Another asks whether the blacksmith repaired wagon wheels damaged last week. Even here, ordinary life continues threading through everything. You step back outside into the freezing evening air. Snowflakes drift softly beneath lantern light while the church bell stands silent now against the dark sky above. The settlement glows faintly ahead through chimney smoke and falling snow. And as you walk back toward the cabins beside other weary settlers, you begin understanding that frontier communities survive not only through labour, but through shared rituals helping tired people feel slightly less alone against the enormous winter night surrounding them. The cold feels sharper after leaving the church. Perhaps because the warmth inside had briefly softened your senses. Now the night air presses firmly against your face while snowflakes drift slowly through lantern light across the settlement road. You pull your coat tighter and continue toward the cabin. Nearby footsteps crunch rhythmically through frozen snow while distant dogs bark somewhere beyond the darkened barns. Smoke hangs low over the settlement tonight, trapping the scent of burning pine across the still winter air. The entire frontier smells of smoke after sunset. You notice it constantly now. A lantern swings gently from a nearby porch as you pass. Its yellow light reveals muddy tracks frozen solid beside the doorway. Inside the cabin beyond the window, figures move slowly through shadows near a glowing hearth. Life continues quietly behind every wall. Cooking, mending, coughing, praying. You step inside your own cabin and immediately feel the familiar wave of warmth mixed with stale smoke and damp wool. The fire burns lower now, glowing red beneath dark logs while soup simmers softly in an iron pot suspended above the coals. The smell is rich tonight. Onions, perhaps. Maybe dried herbs too. You remove snow-covered gloves near the hearth while someone nearby crushes leaves and roots together using a wooden mortar. The sharp, earthy scent spreads through the room almost immediately. Medicine preparation, or at least something intended as medicine. Frontier families relied heavily upon homemade remedies because the trained doctors often lived many miles away. During winter storms, outside medical help could become completely unreachable for days or even weeks. You move closer toward the table. Dried bundles hang from ceiling beams overhead. Mint leaves, chamomile, possibly sage. Some herbs smell pleasant, others release bitter medicinal odours, filling the cabin with sharp earthy air. A steaming cup appears beside the fire, dark liquid inside. One child wrinkles their nose dramatically at the smell. The reaction feels understandable. A wide range of folk remedies circulated through frontier communities during the 19th century, passed between neighbours and relatives through memory rather than formal medical training. Some genuinely eased symptoms. Others likely accomplished little beyond comforting worried families. You sit near the hearth while the herbal mixture continues heating slowly beside the soup pot. The fire crackles gently beneath the iron grate, casting soft orange light across tired faces around the room. Outside wind brushes against the cabin walls. Inside, the atmosphere feels close and heavy. One older woman quietly explains that the mixture should help with chest congestion brought on by winter cold. She stirs carefully using a wooden spoon worn smooth from years of cooking and medicine making alike. The boundary between food and medicine often blurred on the frontier. Garlic treated illness, whiskey dulled pain. Honey soothed coughs when available. One especially curious frontier practice involved placing sliced onions inside socks overnight to draw sickness from the body through the feet. Versions of this belief appeared across several rural communities despite uncertain origins and questionable results. Still desperate, people try many things. You accept a cup of the steaming mixture politely after it cools slightly. The liquid tastes bitter and smoky with faint sweetness beneath the stronger herbal flavours. Not enjoyable, but warming. Nearby, someone opens a small wooden box containing sewing needles, cloth strips, and tiny wrapped packets of dried powders used for remedies. Frontier households stored medical supplies carefully because replacements could prove difficult to obtain during harsh seasons. A thoughtful review of frontier medical records suggests many settlers blended practical treatment with inherited traditions from European indigenous and regional folk practices. Medical knowledge travelled across communities through conversation as much as formal instruction. You hold the warm cup between your hands while listening to the soft sounds filling the cabin. Soup bubbling, fabric rustling, quiet coughing near the wall. The fire settles lower as another log shifts inward with a dull crack. A child beside the hearth receives a spoonful of syrup mixed with herbs and immediately makes a face of theatrical misery. Laughter follows softly around the room. Small moments like that matter deeply tonight. The wind outside strengthens briefly, rattling the windows and pushing loose snow against the cabin walls. Someone rises to check the door latch automatically before returning toward the fire. People remain alert here. Even during ordinary evenings, illness carried serious danger across isolated settlements, particularly during winter months, when weakened bodies faced freezing temperatures and limited medical access. Fevers, lung infections, and contaminated wounds could become life-threatening quickly. You glance towards the shelf near the fireplace where jars of preserved berries, dried roots, and wrapped cloth bundles sit together beside cooking supplies. Everything useful shares space inside frontier homes. Nothing wasted. Nothing decorative without reason. A younger woman begins describing a remedy her mother once used involving goose fat rubbed across the chest during severe coughs. Another person insists pine needle tea prevented winter sickness entirely if consumed often enough. Nobody agrees completely, yet everyone contributes stories. That exchange itself feels important. Recent scholarship exploring rural oral traditions notes that storytelling often preserves practical survival knowledge within frontier communities. Remedies, weather signs, and household techniques spread through repeated conversations during evenings exactly like this one. You finish the last sip from the cup while warmth spreads slowly through your chest. Outside, the snow continues falling gently beyond the frosted windows, covering wagon tracks and muddy paths beneath fresh white layers. The cabin grows quieter now, more tired. The long workday has finally begun settling heavily across everyone's shoulders. Still, someone continues stirring soup. Someone else folds cloth near the hearth. Another checks the herbal bundles hanging overhead before tomorrow's chores begin again. And as you watch the firelight flicker across shelves crowded with homemade remedies and worn household tools, you begin understanding how frontier survival depended not only upon strength, but upon generations of shared knowledge passed quietly between tired hands beside winter fires. A few days each month, the road into town becomes unusually crowded. Tonight is one of those evenings. You leave the cabin again after supper. Preparations begin pulling your coat tightly against the falling snow, while lantern light flickers across muddy wagon tracks outside. The air smells cold enough to sting your lungs with every breath. Still, people continue traveling toward town. Supplies cannot wait forever. The road feels rough beneath your boots where frozen ruts twist through packed snow and hardened mud. Ahead, several wagons creak slowly through the darkness, while horses snort clouds of steam into the night air. Lanterns sway gently from sagging sides, tiny moving stars against the storm. You walk beside other settlers wrapped in wool scarves and heavy coats stiff from repeated weather exposure. Conversations drift quietly through the cold. Flour prices, broken tools, rumours about railroad workers farther west. Frontier towns became essential lifelines for isolated farming communities during the late 19th century. Even small settlements usually contained blacksmith shops, general stores, churches, stables, and occasionally saloons or boarding houses clustered around muddy central roads. As the town finally appears ahead, warm yellow light glows through frosted windows beside drifting chimney smoke. The sight feels strangely welcoming after long hours spent among dark frozen fields. The streets remain messy despite the snow. Always messy. Horse manure mixes with slush beneath wagon wheels, while muddy footprints cover every wooden walkway. A dog darts between wagons, searching for scraps near the general store entrance. The town smells alive. Coal smoke, wet leather, whiskey drifting from a nearby saloon, fresh bread somewhere farther down the street. You step carefully onto the crowded boardwalk outside the general store, while people move constantly around you carrying sacks, tools, and bundled supplies beneath falling snow. The store bell jingles sharply as the door opens. Warmth spills outward immediately. Inside, the room feels crowded and noisy compared to the quiet settlement cabins. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, stacked with canned goods, lamp oil, fabric nails, boots, tobacco, and glass jars filled with candy or preserved foods. Every item looks as valuable, some almost luxurious. You brush snow from your sleeves while stepping deeper into the store. The wooden floor creaks beneath muddy boots, while lantern light flickers warmly against hanging tools overhead. A broad pattern visible in rural commerce records and shows general stores often operated partly through barter as much as cash exchange. Farmers traded eggs, hides, firewood, or labour in return for supplies they could not produce themselves. Near the counter, two men argue softly over wagon repairs, while the storekeeper weighs flour using heavy iron scales. Nearby, a woman examines fabric bolts carefully with reddened winter hands. Nobody shops casually here. Every purchase matters. You move toward shelves containing preserved foods stacked tightly in rows. Salted fish, dried beans, molasses. Small sacks of coffee stored carefully behind the counter, where moisture cannot damage them. Prices rise during harsh winters. Everyone notices. One especially strange frontier fad involved miracle tonics sold by travelling salesmen claiming to cure nearly every illness imaginable. Some mixtures contained harmless herbs, others secretly included alcohol or questionable chemicals that left customers feeling temporarily energetic before disappointment returned. A painted advertisement near the doorway promises relief from headaches, coughs, poor digestion, nervousness, and baldness all at once. Quite ambitious, honestly, said Lizzie. You continue deeper into the store while voices blend together beneath the warm, crowded atmosphere. Boots scrape the floorboards. Coins clink against the counter. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs loudly enough to turn several heads. The sound feels rare after the quiet settlement roads. A closer analysis of frontier towns suggests these places offered more than supplies alone. They created rare opportunities for social interaction, gossip, entertainment, and connection beyond isolated farmsteads scattered across enormous distances. You stop near the stove at the centre of the room where several settlers warm stiff hands against the iron surface. The stove radiates thick, heavy heat, carrying scents of coal smoke and damp wool into the crowded air. Conversations grow easier here, looser. One traveller claims cattle prices may improve by spring. Another insists a neighbouring settlement suffered severe illness after contaminated well water spread sickness through several families. News spreads quickly in places like this. Accuracy spreads more slowly. Outside the store windows, snow continues falling steadily beneath gas lamps lining the muddy street. Through the glass, you glimpse the blacksmith shop farther down the road, where sparks still leap briefly into the dark whenever the forge opens. Blacksmiths held extraordinary importance across frontier towns. They repaired wagon wheels, horseshoes, farming tools, hinges, chains, and nearly every essential metal object required for daily life. You purchase a small sack of nails and a wrapped packet of coffee before stepping back toward the entrance. Nearby, a child stares longingly at striped candy displayed inside a glass jar near the counter. The parent gently shakes their head. Maybe next time. Or maybe not. A few scholars studying frontier economics argue many rural families lived in near-permanent financial instability despite outward appearances of self-sufficiency. Crop failures, medical emergencies, or harsh winters could erase years of careful work remarkably quickly. The store bell rings again as another customer enters carrying fresh snow on their shoulders. Cold air rushes briefly through the crowded room before the door closes once more. You step back outside moments later. The night feels sharper now after the warmth indoors. Snowflakes drift lazily across lantern light while wagons continue creaking through muddy streets lined with glowing windows and drifting chimney smoke. The town remains rough, crowded, unfinished, yet standing there beneath the falling snow surrounded by tired settlers trading supplies and stories beneath flickering lights, you realize frontier towns offered something nearly as valuable as food or tools. They reminded isolated people that other lives still existed beyond the dark frozen fields waiting outside town limits. By the time you return from town, the snow has nearly stopped. The settlement lies quiet beneath a pale layer of fresh white powder, reflecting moonlight across the frozen fields. Chimney smoke drifts lazily upward into the dark sky while warm yellow glows flicker behind frosted cabin windows. The world feels softer now, more distant. Your boots creak through snow as you walk toward the cabin, carrying the small sack of supplies beneath your arm. The cold air smells cleaner after snowfall, though traces of wood smoke still linger everywhere across the settlement. A fiddle begins playing somewhere nearby, faint at first, then clearer. You stop walking briefly and listen. The melody drifts softly from one of the larger cabins near the edge of town, where several lanterns glow warmly through thin curtains. Laughter follows the music a few moments later. A gathering tonight, not unusual during winter. Settlers searched constantly for small moments of relief from labour and isolation. Entertainment rarely arrived in grand dramatic forms. Instead, it appeared through music, storytelling, card games, shared meals, and conversations stretching beside fires late into the evening. You change direction slightly and move closer toward the cabin where the music continues. Snow crunches quietly beneath your boots while voices rise and fall through the cold air ahead. The fiddle player sounds talented enough, or perhaps everyone simply appreciates music after long workdays. You step onto the crowded porch and knock lightly before entering. Warmth and noise spill outward immediately around you. Inside the cabin feels transformed compared to ordinary evenings. Lanterns burn brighter. More chairs crowd the room. Several coats hang dripping near the doorway while boots line the wall beneath the windows. The smell of stew tobacco smoke, damp wool and fresh bread fills the warm, crowded air. People smile as you enter. Tired smiles mostly, still genuine. The fiddle player sits near the fireplace drawing smooth, quick notes from the instrument, while a younger man taps rhythm against the floorboards using his heel. Children sit cross-legged near the hearth, listening wide-eyed, as older settlers trade stories near the table. A broad review of rural social customs during the 19th century reveals these informal gatherings played a vital role in maintaining community bonds. Harsh weather and geographic isolation made shared evenings emotionally important for many frontier families. You settle near the wall while someone hands you a steaming tin cup filled with cider warmed beside the fire. Cinnamon and apple drift upward through the steam. A rare luxury tonight. The room hums with layered sounds now. Quiet conversation near the table. Laughter beside the stove. The steady fiddle melody weaving gently through everything else. One woman begins recounting a story about getting stranded during a spring flood years earlier while travelling west with her family. She gestures dramatically enough that several children lean closer immediately. Certain details sound exaggerated. Nobody seems concerned. Frontier storytelling often blurred memory and performance together. Ordinary events grew larger during retellings, especially during winter evenings when entertainment options remained limited. One old tale still circulating through some prairie communities described phantom wagon lights appearing during blizzards to guide lost travelers safely toward shelter. Whether anyone truly believed such stories mattered less than the comfort they offered during dangerous weather. You sip the warm cider slowly. Sweetness spreads pleasantly through your chest. Near the fireplace, two children attempt awkward dance steps while the fiddle player shifts into a quicker tune. Their boots slide clumsily across the floorboards, producing bursts of laughter from nearby adults. For a moment, the settlement feels almost carefree. Almost. A closer reading of frontier letters and memoirs often reveals how deeply settlers valued simple entertainment. Music, jokes, and storytelling interrupted exhausting routines that otherwise repeated endlessly through seasons of labor and uncertainty. The firelight flickers warmly across crowded faces around the room. Wrinkles soften beneath the lantern glow while shadows dance gently along the ceiling beams overhead. You notice how exhausted everyone still appears despite the cheerful atmosphere. Heavy shoulders, slow movements, hands roughened by work, yet people came anyway. That matters. One older man produces a deck of worn playing cards from his coat pocket, while another begins carving small wooden figures beside the stove using a pocket knife polished smooth from years of use. Tiny hobbies survive even here. A woman near the table quietly hums along with the fiddle melody while repairing a torn mitten between conversations. Work never fully disappears on the frontier. It simply blends into moments of rest. Outside wind brushes softly against the cabin walls while snow continues sliding gently from the roof edges into the dark yard beyond. Inside, heat and human voices push back against the winter night. Researchers exploring emotional resilience in frontier communities often point toward communal gatherings as important forms of psychological relief. Shared entertainment allowed settlers brief escape from constant physical demands and lingering anxieties. You listen while another story begins near the hearth. This one involves a stubborn mule refusing to cross a shallow creek for nearly 6 hours before eventually sitting down directly in the wagon path. The storyteller imitates the mule's expression so dramatically that laughter erupts throughout the room. Even you laugh softly. The sound feels good after such a long, cold day. The fiddle slows eventually into gentler melodies while conversations settle lower around the room. Some children now will sleep against their parents' shoulders beside the fire. The hour grows late. Lantern flames burn lower, yet nobody rushes immediately toward home. Outside waits darkness, cold wind, frozen chores waiting again tomorrow morning. Inside remains warmth music and the comforting reminder that other weary people share the same difficult life. And as the fiddle continues playing softly beneath drifting firelight and murmured conversation, you realize frontier settlers survived not only through work and endurance, but through these fragile human moments that made harsh lives feel briefly lighter before another winter morning arrived again. The gathering finally ends when exhaustion outweighs conversation. One by one, settlers pull coats around tired shoulders and step back into the freezing night. Lanterns sway gently through falling snow while muffled farewells drift across the dark settlement road. You walk home slowly. The fiddle music fades behind you. Ahead, your cabin glows softly through frosted windows beneath a thin ribbon of chimney smoke. The sight feels comforting after hours spent outside among wind and darkness. Inside waits supper, and more work afterward. You push open the door and immediately smell stew thickening above the fire. Warm air brushes against your face, carrying scents of onion smoke, salt pork, and damp wool drying beside the hearth. The room appears quieter now, heavier somehow. Children already fight sleep beside the fire while adults move through evening chores with slow, deliberate motions. A kettle rattles softly near the stove. Someone folds blankets beside the wall. The long day finally shows itself in everyone's posture. You remove your gloves carefully and sit near the table while bowls are arranged across the rough wooden surface. Firelight flickers across dented spoons and mismatched cups polished smooth through years of use. The stew smells wonderful tonight, mostly because you are hungry again. A recurring pattern visible in frontier household records shows evening meals often became the largest shared moment of the day. Families scattered across different chores during daylight hours, but reunited beside the fire after sunset whenever possible. You wrap cold hands around the warm bowl placed before you. Steam curls upward slowly, while tiny drops of melted snow slide from your coat onto the floorboards below. The first spoonful burned your tongue slightly. Still worth it. The broth tastes rich with potatoes, onions, herbs, and small pieces of preserved meat stretched carefully through the meal. Bread passes slowly around the table while someone refills cups with hot coffee, already growing weaker from repeated use of grounds. Nothing fancy here, just filling. Outside wind brushes against the cabin walls while snow taps lightly against the windows. The sounds feel distant now beneath crackling firewood and quiet conversation around the table. One person mentions needing new horseshoes before spring thaw arrives. Another worries about dwindling lamp oil supplies after recent storms delayed wagon deliveries into town. Even supper conversations revolve around survival. You tear another piece of bread and dip it slowly into the steaming broth. Your shoulders ache more noticeably now that the day's labor has finally stopped. Muscles stiffen quickly beside the fire after hours spent working outdoors. The warmth almost makes you sleepy. Almost. A number of surviving frontier journals describe evening fatigue so intense that settlers occasionally fell asleep still wearing work clothes beside the hearth before properly preparing for bed. You understand how that could happen. Near the fireplace, one younger child leans sideways against an older sibling already half asleep. Their boots remain muddy beside the door where melting snow forms shallow puddles across the floor. The fire pops loudly. Nobody reacts much anymore. Open flames feel ordinary after enough years around them. One lesser-known frontier habit involved hanging wet socks or gloves near the fireplace overnight using string stretched across cabins. The results often smelled terrible by morning, but frozen clothing could become dangerous during winter labour without proper drying. You notice several damp garments hanging there now. The cabin carries that exact smell: wet wool, smoke, hot iron. A thoughtful review of frontier domestic life suggests evenings often blended work and rest together, rather than separating them cleanly. Supper did not signal true relaxation. It simply shifted labour indoors beneath firelight. That truth becomes obvious quickly. As soon as bowls empty, new tasks begin almost automatically. Someone scrapes leftover food into storage containers. Someone else checks water buckets for morning use. Another feeds additional logs carefully into the fire before nighttime temperatures drop further. You help stack cleaned dishes beside the wash basin. The water already cools rapidly despite the heat nearby. Across the room, quiet sewing resumes beneath lantern light while another family member repairs a harness strap using thick thread and steady hands. The entire cabin hums softly with tired activity. Outside, darkness deepens completely beyond the frosted windows. Only faint lantern glows from neighbouring cabins remain visible through drifting snow and chimney smoke. You sit briefly beside the fire afterward while the room settles into calmer rhythms. The stew pot now hangs nearly empty above glowing embers. Shadows move slowly across the ceiling beams whenever flames shift beneath fresh logs. Someone yawns openly. Another rubs aching knees. The hearth. The weariness feels shared tonight. Researchers studying rural family life in the 19th century often point toward evening routines as emotionally important moments despite exhaustion. Shared meals and firelit conversations created small islands of stability within lives, shaped heavily by uncertainty and labour. You understand that now while listening to the cabin around you, the soft scrape of sewing needles, the quiet murmur of conversation, the steady breathing of children drifting towards sleep. Outside, winter continues endlessly across the dark fields surrounding the settlement. Wind moves through fences and frozen trees beyond sight, while snow slowly buries the wagon tracks from earlier tonight. Yet inside the cabin, warmth still holds. Barely, perhaps, but enough. And as the final bowls are cleared from the table and another log settles deeper into the fire, you realize frontier evenings were not peaceful because life became easier after sunset. They felt peaceful because exhausted people had survived another difficult day together beneath one small roof against the enormous winter night outside. Long after supper ends, another difficult task still waits. Laundry. The word sounds harmless enough from a modern distance. Yet frontier washing demanded strength, patience, heated water, and stubborn endurance against cold weather that seemed determined to freeze everything solid before the work finished. You kneel beside the wash basin near the fire, while someone pours steaming water from the kettle into a large wooden tub. Steam rises thickly into the cabin air, carrying smells of soap smoke and damp cloth. The heat fogs the nearby window immediately. Outside, snow continues drifting silently through darkness. Inside, sleeves roll upward once more. A pile of clothing waits beside the tub. Wool socks stiff with mud. Shirts carrying smoke and sweat deep within the fabric. Children's clothes stained from barn chores and frozen slush near the animal pens. Nothing stays clean along here. Nothing. You dip your hands into the steaming water carefully. The warmth almost hurts after spending so many hours outdoors. Rough homemade soap rests nearby on a chipped dish beside the scrubbing board leaning against the tub. The board itself looks worn smooth in places, used constantly. A closer examination of the 19th century household labour shows laundry ranked among the most physically exhausting domestic tasks, especially during winter months when water froze quickly and drying clothing became complicated. You lift a shirt from the pile, heavy, damp. The fabric smells strongly of soak and cold air trapped deep within the fibres. You rub soap across the cloth before pressing it against the ridged scrubbing board. Back and forth. Again. The motion becomes rhythmic after several minutes, while water splashes against your sleeves and drips onto the floorboards below. Your shoulders begin aching almost immediately. A younger child nearby folds already dried cloth near the hearth, while another person feeds more wood into the fire to maintain enough heat for washing water. Everything connects together here. Laundry requires firewood. Firewood requires chopping. Chopping requires time and strength. Frontier life rarely allowed separate chores. One unusual custom recorded in several prairie communities involved adding small amounts of starch made from boiled potatoes into laundry water to stiffen collars and cuffs. The results apparently worked reasonably well, though some families complained about lingering food smells afterward. The thought feels strangely practical. You wring water from a wool sock, slowly twisting until your fingers ache from pressure. Dirty water drips heavily back into the tub while steam curls around your hands. The cabin smells overwhelmingly damp now. Wet cloth, soap, smoke from the fire struggling against all the moisture. Outside wind rattles the walls softly, while darkness presses against the windows. You feel far removed from the noisy town and lantern-lit gathering earlier tonight. Only work remains now. A broad survey of rural household diaries reveals many women spent entire days washing clothing during certain seasons, especially in larger families where muddy labour and harsh weather dirtied garments almost immediately. You understand why. The pile beside the tub never seems smaller. One shirt finishes, another begins. Your knuckles redden from hot water and rough fabric while tiny soap bubbles drift across the tub surface beneath flickering firelight. A nearby kettle whistles softly again. More water needed. Always more. The person beside the hearth lifts another steaming pot carefully, using thick cloth wrapped around both hands. The metal handle glows faintly near the firelight while hot water pours into the washing tub with clouds of rising steam. The warmth feels pleasant briefly, then exhausting again. Some frontier families reportedly postponed laundry during severe cold spells because wet clothing could freeze stiff within minutes outdoors. Others simply washed smaller amounts nightly near the fire to avoid overwhelming labour later in the week. You scrub another sleeve against the board while listening to the cabin settle gradually into deeper night. Time quiet. Children now sleep beneath heavy blankets near the wall. Conversations grow softer. Only the scrape of fabric, the crackling fire, and the occasional splash of water remain. A thoughtful interpretation from social historians can suggest domestic labour often disappeared from older frontier stories because much of it happened privately inside cabins rather than publicly in fields or towns. Yet these invisible tasks remained absolutely necessary for survival. You hang freshly washed garments near the fireplace using rope stretched between wooden beams overhead. Water drips steadily onto old cloth spread across the floor beneath them. The clothing sways gently in rising heat. Some pieces may still feel damp by morning. The fire burns lower now, throwing deeper shadows across the room, while orange embers pulse softly beneath blackened logs. Your arms feel heavy from the repetitive work. Still the laundry continues. One more shirt, then another pair of socks. The soap itself feels rough against your skin, leaving fingers dry and cracked after repeated use. Homemade frontier soap varied wildly in quality depending upon ingredients and skill. Some batches cleaned effectively, others irritated skin badly enough to leave painful burns. A few frontier recipes even recommended adding ashes directly into wash water for stronger cleaning power. Whether that improved results or simply damaged fabric faster remains uncertain. You finally pause and lean back slightly from the steaming tub. The room has grown quieter still. Only wind outside now, and soft breathing from sleeping children. You study the hanging clothes swaying gently above the firelight while damp heat fills the cabin around you. Every washed shirt represents another hour of labour hidden inside ordinary frontier life. No applause follows. No dramatic stories emerge from it. Yet without this work, sickness has spread faster, clothing deteriorated sooner, and harsh winters became even harder to survive. And as the final pieces of laundry drip slowly beside the dying fire, you begin realizing how much of frontier endurance depended not upon grand, heroic moments, but upon countless unseen tasks completed quietly by tired hands, long after the sun disappeared beyond the frozen fields. The cabin finally grows still, not silent, never truly silent. You settle beneath heavy blankets while the fire burns lower inside the hearth. Red embers pulse softly beneath blackened logs, casting dim flickering light across the walls and ceiling beams overhead. The warmth feels uneven now. Your face stays cool while your legs slowly thaw beneath layers of quilts and wool. Somewhere nearby, damp clothing still hangs drying beside the fire, carrying faint smells of smoke and soap through the darkened room. Outside, winter continues moving. You hear it constantly. Wind brushes across the cabin walls with a low, steady hiss. Snow slides softly from the roof edges into deep drifts below. Bare tree branches creak somewhere beyond the barn whenever stronger gusts move through the settlement. The frontier sounds different at night, larger, lonelier. You shift slightly beneath the blankets while someone nearby coughs once before settling again. Wooden floorboards creak quietly as the cabin cools inch by inch despite the fading fire. A horse calls softly from the barn, then silence returns briefly. Many frontier settlers slept lightly because nighttime often carried genuine risks. Storms strengthened unexpectedly. Livestock escaped broken fences. Fires spread dangerously through dry cabins. Strange noises outside demanded attention, whether welcome or not. You stare toward the frosted window where moonlight glows faintly through thin curtains. The pale light reveals drifting shadow from snow and moving branches outside. Everything looks softer in darkness, even hardship. A surviving collection of rural memoirs from the late 19th century frequently describes how isolated nighttime could feel across frontier settlements. Vast distances between homes, limited outdoor lighting, and severe winter weather often created deep feelings of separation once darkness settled fully over the land. The fire cracks suddenly, sharp and loud. Your attention moves toward the hearth immediately before slowly relaxing again. Embers collapse inward softly beneath the remaining logs while tiny sparks swirl upward through the chimney. You listen carefully afterward. The cabin itself seems alive at night. Timber shifts as temperatures drop, wind presses against loose boards, hanging tools tap gently against walls whenever strong gusts arrive from the fields. One especially persistent frontier superstition claimed hearing unexplained knocking outside after midnight meant someone nearby would soon receive troubling news. Different versions appeared across several rural regions, though nobody entirely agreed where the belief began. Still, strange sounds become easier to imagine in darkness. You pull the blanket slightly higher across your shoulders while cold air slips through tiny gaps near the windows. The fabric smells faintly of cedar and old smoke absorbed through years beside the hearth. Nearby breathing grows deeper now, more people falling asleep. A thoughtful examination of frontier sleeping habits suggests many settlers experienced fragmented rest during winter months. Nighttime chores, sick livestock, crying children, and unpredictable weather often interrupted sleep repeatedly. True uninterrupted rest remained rare. Outside, a distant howl rises briefly across the frozen fields. Faint, far away. Possibly wolves. Possibly coyotes carried strangely through the cold night air. The sound fades almost immediately, leaving only wind again moving across the settlement fences and snow-covered ground beyond sight. You understand now why frontier darkness unsettled people so deeply. Without electric light, night feels enormous. The world beyond the cabin disappears almost completely except for scattered lantern glows from neighbouring homes, tiny islands of warmth surrounded by endless black fields. You close your eyes briefly while listening to the rhythm of the wind outside. The cabin smells calmer now that cooking and laundry have ended. Mostly smoke, cooling ashes, damp wool slowly drying near the hearth. A mouse scratches faintly somewhere behind the wall, then stops. Settlers battled rodents constantly during winter because stored grain and warm cabins attracted mice in large numbers. Some families kept cats primarily for survival rather than companionship, especially after difficult harvest seasons. The fire burns lower again. The room darkens further. You hear someone stir beneath blankets nearby before settling once more into sleep. Another person mutters softly through a dream already forgotten seconds later. Everything's slow. Everything slows. Even the wind outside softens briefly. Some historians examining emotional life on the frontier suggest nighttime may have amplified anxieties hidden during busy daylight hours. Darkness removed distractions, leaving people alone with thoughts about illness, debt storms, crop failures, or distant family members left behind years earlier. Yet night also brought relief. No more chopping wood, no more hauling water, no more frozen fields, at least until morning. You watch moonlight shifting faintly across the ceiling beams while embers continue glowing beneath the dying fire. Shadows stretch and contract slowly whenever small flames rise again from collapsing wood. The settlement sleeps now. Barns dark, roads empty, snow drifting silently across wagon tracks already fading beneath fresh accumulation. A curious detail preserved in some frontier accounts describes settlers occasionally hanging tin objects or small bells near barn doors during winter nights to alert them if animals grew restless or intruders approached through heavy snow. Even sleep required preparation here. You breathe slowly beneath the heavy blankets while the last warmth from the hearth reaches across the cabin floor. Outside, the vast frozen frontier continues endlessly beneath moonlight and wind beyond the fragile wooden walls surrounding you, and as the final embers settle deeper into ash and the sounds of the night grow softer, around the sleeping cabin, you begin understanding how frontier settlers learned to rest. Not because the world felt safe, but because exhaustion eventually became stronger than fear. Before anyone fully sleeps, tomorrow already begins. The fire has nearly burned down to glowing embers when someone quietly rises from beneath the blankets near the wall. You watch through half-tired eyes as another log gets placed carefully onto the coals. The wood catches slowly. A small flame returns. Even nighttime requires planning here. You push yourself upright slightly beneath the heavy quilts, while cold air brushes your face again. Across the cabin, lantern light glows low and golden beside the table where tools now rest waiting for inspection before morning. A hammer, harness, straps, a dull knife needing sharpening. The room feels calmer now than earlier this evening, though not truly restful yet. Small tasks continue quietly beneath the fading firelight while wind whispers against the walls outside. Preparation never fully stops. Not on the frontier. You swing your legs carefully onto the floorboards and pull your coat around your shoulders before moving toward the table. The wood feels cold beneath your bare feet despite lingering warmth near the hearth. Nearby, someone sorts dried beans into smaller sacks for easier cooking tomorrow. Another checks the remaining coffee supply with visible concern. Not much left. A detailed look into frontier household management reveals families often planned daily survival several days ahead whenever possible. Firewood lamp oil, preserved food animal feed, and clean water required constant monitoring because shortages could become dangerous quickly during severe weather. You pick up the knife from the table. The blade looks worn thin from years of sharpening. A whetstone rests nearby beside scraps of leather and loose nails brought back from town earlier tonight. Slowly the blade moves across the stone with a soft scraping sound repeating through the quiet cabin. Steady, careful, necessary. Outside wind shifts across the roof again, carrying loose snow against the windows. The cabin creaks softly in response while the fire crackles lower behind you. The sharpening rhythm becomes strangely calming after several minutes. Metal against stone, breathing, wind outside. A rarely mentioned frontier practice involved storing emergency food supplies inside hidden floor compartments or sealed barrels buried near cabins in case storms, theft, or crop failures disrupted normal survival plans. Some families became remarkably secretive about food storage during difficult years. You test the knife edge carefully with your thumb. Sharper now. Good enough for tomorrow's chores. Across the room, a harness strap gets repaired beneath lay lantern light using thick thread and patient hands. Leather cracks easily during freezing weather, especially after repeated exposure to snow and mud. Every broken tool creates more labor later, so repairs happen now. A thoughtful reading of personal frontier accounts often reveals how deeply routine shaped emotional stability. Predictable evening preparations gave settlers small feelings of control within lives otherwise governed heavily by weather and uncertainty. You glance toward the shelves near the fireplace where jars and sacks now sit organized carefully for morning use. Flour near the front, salted meat wrapped tightly against moisture. Candles counted quietly one by one. Nothing accidental here. Everything measured. A younger child stirs beneath blankets briefly before drifting back towards sleep. their boots dry beside the fire, still muddy from today's work near the barns. The sight feels oddly symbolic, rest waiting beside labour already prepared for tomorrow. One especially peculiar superstition found in scattered frontier communities warned against sweeping cabin floors after dark because it supposedly swept away tomorrow's luck. Some families ignored the belief completely, while others avoided nighttime cleaning just in case. You smile faintly imagining muddy frontier cabins protected by superstition from additional sweeping. The lantern flame trembles gently as someone opens the door briefly to check conditions outside. Cold air spills through the cabin instantly, carrying sharp smells of snow and frozen earth. The night appears calm now, no storm approaching. That itself feels fortunate. You move toward the fireplace and add another small log beside the larger burning wood. Sparks rise softly through the chimney while orange light flickers across the walls and ceiling beams. The warmth reaches your hands first, then slowly your feet. Several recent studies examining frontier settlement patterns suggest winter survival often depended less upon dramatic disasters than upon careful daily management of limited resources. Tiny mistakes repeated over time created larger dangers remarkably quickly. You understand that now. The careful stacking of wood, the repaired harness, the counted candles, nothing here exists casually. Near the table, quiet conversation drifts through the dim cabin, while tomorrow's chores get discussed softly. Fence repairs after breakfast, water hauling before sunrise, possibly checking animal tracks near the north pasture after fresh snowfall. The routine continues endlessly. Still, there is comfort inside that repetition, too. Outside the frontier stretches dark and frozen beyond sight. Snow covers wagon tracks. Barn roofs gleam faintly beneath moonlight hidden behind thin clouds. Far away, a coyote calls once into the enormous winter silence. Then nothing. You return slowly toward the blankets while lantern light grows lower beside the shovel. The remaining tasks finally end one by one. Tools stacked neatly, food covered carefully, fire prepared for morning revival. Another day arranged before sleep fully arrives. And as the cabin settles once more into near silence beneath drifting snow and fading embers, you begin understanding that frontier survival depended not only upon hard work itself, but upon the quiet nightly discipline of preparing tired bodies and fragile homes to endure the next demanding dawn already waiting just beyond the darkness. The cabin finally settles into true stillness sometime after midnight. The lantern has been extinguished. Only the faint glow of dying embers remains near the hearth, breathing soft orange light across the dark room. Shadows stretch gently along the walls while wind moves quietly beyond the frozen windows. You lie beneath thick quilts, listening. The sounds feel familiar now. Wood creaking softly, someone breathing deeply, snow brushing against the roof in light drifting waves. The frontier night no longer feels entirely hostile. Exhaustion has softened its sharper edges. After one full day inside this world, you begin understanding how settlers learn to exist within hardship rather than constantly fighting against it. Your body feels heavy, a deep tiredness, the kind earned slowly through hauling water, splitting wood, walking frozen fields, and carrying endless small responsibilities from dawn until darkness. Outside, the snow continues falling across fences, barns, wagon roads, and silent fields stretching far beyond sight. By morning, the settlement will look slightly different again. Softer, whiter, colder perhaps. And still the work will continue. A careful study of frontier family routines reveals how repetitive daily labor created the foundation of settlement survival across 19th century America. Not dramatic adventures, not legendary gunfights or grand victories over wilderness. Mostly ordinary people repeating necessary tasks despite fatigue, weather, and uncertainty. You understand that truth now more clearly than before. The frontier was built quietly, one chore at a time. The fire shifts faintly, a final crack, then calm again. You pull the blanket closer beneath your chin while cold air lingers near the edges of the room. The wool smells faintly of smoke and cedar carried through countless winters before this one. Nearby a child murmurs softly during sleep. Then silence returns. The darkness feels gentler now than earlier tonight. Perhaps because the cabin itself has become familiar. The hanging coats, the rough floorboards, the shelves lined with tools and jars and carefully saved supplies. Everything earned, everything necessary. One interesting detail preserved in several frontier recollections describes settlers occasionally sleeping in partial layers of daytime clothing during severe winters, because dressing again before dawn felt unbearable in freezing cabins before the fire revived. You suspect tonight might be one of those nights. The wind slows gradually up. Outside, snow settles softly across the world beyond the cabin walls. Somewhere far away, a lone animal calls once into the darkness before fading again into silence. The settlement sleeps, horses resting in barns, lanterns extinguished, roads empty beneath fresh snow, and tomorrow already waits quietly beyond the horizon. A number of modern historians have noted that frontier life demanded emotional endurance as much as physical strength. Repetition, isolation, uncertainty, and harsh weather shaped daily existence in ways difficult for modern people to fully imagine. Yet within that hardship existed smaller, quieter moments too. Warm soup after cold labour, fiddle music beside lantern light, children laughing briefly in the snow, hands working together without needing many words. You close your eyes while the final warmth from the embers reaches faintly across the room. Your breathing slows naturally, beside the soft rhythm of the sleeping cabin around you. The day feels complete now. Not easy, never easy, but complete. And somewhere beyond the dark frozen fields of 1880, America, countless other settlers lie beneath similar blankets tonight, listening to similar winds move across similar wooden walls. Tired people, ordinary people, people who woke before sunrise and worked until exhaustion because survival demanded it. The frontier was not only shaped by famous names or dramatic moments remembered in history books, it was shaped by quiet routines repeated endlessly by families whose stories rarely travelled beyond their own small settlements. People who carried water through snowstorms, people who patched old coats beside weak lantern light, people who measured coffee carefully and prayed the fire would survive until morning. As the night deepens around you, those lives begin feeling less distant now, less like stories, more like real human days filled with cold fingers, aching backs drifting, smoke-muddy boots and tiny moments of comfort shared beside winter fires. The embers dim further. The cabin cools slowly. Outside snow continues covering the wagon tracks leading towards town, smoothing sharp edges beneath soft white silence. You breathe deeply beneath the blankets one final time while the frontier night settles fully around the sleeping settlement, and little by little the sounds fade. The wind softens. The fire quiets. The long, exhausting day finally slips away into darkness. Sleep well.